Control the sky and you control the battlefield. Control the sky and you control the war. In all of modern combat, everywhere on Earth in the 21st century, there is one fundamental rule to warfare that rules them all. There is no power greater than air power. It's one of those things that should sound controversial. After all, the nuclear weapon is the most powerful device on Earth. The drone and the powers of cyberspace are the world's most formidable emerging technologies, and in nearly every global military, only a small portion of troops will make it their life's work to wage war in the skies. But cross the nuclear gap, and there's no point having a war anyway. Depends on drones or cyberspace alone, and you'll be woefully out of depth when the major battle arrives. And even across global war zones where a tiny handful of pilots fly above thousands and thousands of soldiers on the ground, it is the pilot and the war beast they fly that can make an entire battlefield fall silent. So today on WarFronts, we're going to do something a little different, and even a brief look at the runtime of this episode should make it clear that, well, we've got a lot to say. Today we're doing a deep dive into the air forces of the world to analyze what they fly, how they work, and why they believe the choices they made for the Air Force will enable them to fight and win. So grab yourself a snack, pour yourself a drink, and get ready for a long walk or a long drive home in the traffic if you're me. Or if you really want to get into the spirit, fire up your favorite flight sim and take this journey with us. It's time to talk about air power. All right, so we're settling in for a substantial undertaking. So as we set our terms of engagement, there are a few spots that we need to focus on. First, our subjects. We're going to start off with the small. The global air forces with not too tremendous of an amount of kit, but often with a highly eclectic, fascinating mix of aircraft and capabilities, especially when we compare their air power against their neighbors and adversaries. Then we'll get bigger as we go, from the local powers that can throw their weight around in their own small pond, to the regional powers that could have their way with most air forces nearby, to the world-class flying fleets that can really do the dirty work, and finally to the superpower air forces that run this whole game. All love, of course, to places like Iceland or Grenada or Samoa or Palau, but if you haven't got an air force, then we'll check in with you on some other episode. As we progress through each section, we'll take our own little world tour, first in East and Central Asia, then the Middle East, then Latin America, then Africa, and finally Europe, before we check in with any place that might not fall into those neat little boxes. We won't be going over every single air force in the world, but the ones we pass over, we'll skip because their air forces resemble other air forces that we have already talked about. In one little bit of housekeeping, we'll be drawing from a wide range of sources, as always, in this episode, but for a point of reference on what each global air force has in its arsenal, we'll be referring to Flight Global's annual World Air Forces Directory for 2024. And in housekeeping point number 2, we'll just clue you in on the existence of our sister channel Mega Projects. If you hear about a cool aircraft that you'd like to learn about, then we've probably already covered it in length over there. And one final note, once we get to the regional powers on our list, we'll begin accounting for things like army attack helicopters and naval air wings. Okay, housekeeping done. Let's begin with an ode to the little guys, as we begin our tour of the little guys in Asia as promised. First, let's zero in on Cambodia, where the Royal Cambodian Air Force lists of combat-ready fixed-wing aircraft comes in at a grand total of 6. Yes, when we say we're starting with the little guys, we actually mean it. Cambodia flies 6 Aero Vodochody L-39 jets, known around the world as the Albatross. They're primarily a trainer jet made in the Czech Republic, although Cambodia uses them primarily for border patrol and to protect its airspace, and other nations have put them to good use in combat environments. Although it's not exactly a hallmark of world-class air forces, the L-39 is a popular aircraft, currently flying with well over 3 dozen national air forces, meaning that you can be sure you'll see it again. Alongside its L-39s, Cambodia flies a number of formidable rotorcraft, helicopters that are more than capable of laying waste to ground units and providing close air support during military operations. Like a wide variety of nations around the world, Cambodia prefers to keep a relatively larger number of helicopters rather than splurging on a number of high-powered jets. When not serving in a combat role, helicopters like these could be put to work for other utility purposes in a way that a specialized fighter jet just can't, and they're also a lot cheaper, especially when you buy them second-hand. Cambodia flies several copies of each of the Soviet-made MiL Mi-8 and Mi-17, each of which can be configured for duties as a gunship, a troop transport, a mobile command post, a reconnaissance craft, and more. And get used to these 2 helicopters. Taken together, they're the third most common set of military aircraft in the world. Alongside those, Cambodia flies a dozen Harbin Z9 choppers, also gunship capable, built as a Chinese export variant of a French helicopter known as the Dolphin. From Cambodia, let's go over to Bangladesh, still firmly in the category of lesser global air forces, but a bit more formidable than our first entry. In total, Bangladesh flies well over 40 fighter aircraft, but the ones that really matter are a squadron of 8. These are the 4th generation MiG-29s, Russian multi-role fighters known in NATO nations as the Fulcrum. They're a mainstay of global air forces, and in many of those air wings, they are the centerpiece aircraft. Capable of screaming through the air at Mach 2.3, nearly 2,500 kilometers per hour, or over 1,500 miles per hour, the MiG-29 is highly capable, highly maneuverable, and it's very well armed. Bangladesh backs up the MiG-29 with 36 older fighters, Chinese-built versions of MiG-29's grandfather, the MiG-21. Hailing from an era when making a fighter jet was all about strapping missiles onto pilots into the closest thing you could build to a missile, the MiG-21 hits speeds closer to the MiG-29, although it's a good deal less sophisticated in just about every other way. Bangladesh's version is the Chengdu J7, a Chinese-built variant that's popular across Asia and Africa. Among Bangladesh's other flying forces, it leverages 36 of the same attack helicopter Cambodia relies on, the MiL Mi-17. Its Soviet-made attack helicopter is joined by American and Italian choppers in support roles. But just as important as combat aircraft for a modern air force is the ability to conduct tactical airlift, to ferry troops, weapons, supplies, and heavy fighting equipment and more into the places where they might be needed. Unlike Cambodia, which flies fewer transport planes than you could count on one hand, Bangladesh is the proud owner of a total of 8 American-made C-130s, powerful tactical transport aircraft that can carry over 60 airborne troops or 2 armored personnel carriers. In recent years, Bangladesh's Air Force has gotten a workout as part of a variety of ongoing United Nations deployments, where they and their countrymen from the Bangladesh Armed Services have become the largest troop contributor in the world for UN peacekeeping missions. Continuing our march eastward, we hit Afghanistan, where we've got to give our first, but certainly not our last, caveat of the day. Hopefully, it'll be no surprise to our viewers in the mid-2020s that Afghanistan was recently involved in this little thing called the War on Terror, and that at the conclusion of the War on Terror, it was taken over by the Taliban. As a result, we'll be talking mostly about Afghanistan before the Taliban takeover, where although nothing in its combat arsenal was attached to a jet engine, it had some unique potential nonetheless. Pre-Taliban Afghanistan relied on nearly 20 single-propeller aircraft built in Brazil, known as the A-29 Super Tucano. Although they look like something out of World War II, the Super Tucano is a very modern aircraft, with production lines first opening up in 2003, courtesy of the Embraer Corporation. Armed to the teeth and jam-packed with 21st century sensor technology, the Super Tucano is one of the very best close air support aircraft in the world. And for Afghanistan, their place at the heart of the Air Force makes a good deal of sense. After all, these planes were meant to fight the Taliban, a ground insurgency with no air capabilities of its own. Backing up, the Super Tucano was a combat aircraft that arguably looks even more out of place on the global battlefield, the Cessna 208, known in its civilian role as the Grand Caravan. The planes the Afghan Air Force had, however, went by a rather different name, the Combat Caravan. Capable of firing all sorts of nasty US and NATO standard ammunition, including the Hellfire missile, the Combat Caravan cruises through the skies at about 350 kilometers an hour, 250 miles per hour. But much like a Marvel superhero chasing after their incapacitated prey on a Zamboni, the low and slow profile of the Combat Caravan belied the absolute nastiness that was jam-packed on board. In addition to its fixed-wing aircraft, the combat portion of the Afghan Air Force included nearly 100 of the Soviet attack choppers we mentioned earlier, the Mi-17, plus 8 even more formidable Mi-24s, large gunships and troop transport hybrids that can carry thousands of rounds of ammunition. Afghanistan also flew US-made Black Hawk helicopters, 4 C-130 Hercules transports, and a Boeing 727 for VIP transport purposes. When it became clear to the Afghan government and the US back in 2021 that the Taliban's advance couldn't be stopped after US withdrawal, it became of paramount importance to ensure that as few aircraft as possible fell into the Taliban's hands. Some of the aircraft carried their pilots and passengers straight out of Afghanistan, including Super Tucanos, Combat Caravans, Black Hawks, and more. Ex-Afghan Air Force helicopters would show up in the United States intermittently for the rest of 2021, and much of the inventory that was left in Afghanistan was noted as disabled by US forces before the Americans departed. That being said, the Taliban did get their hands on some of that kit, including a pair of Antonov AN-32 transport planes, 4 non-combat capable Cessna Grand Caravans, 4 of the Mi-17 attack and utility helicopters, and 2 of those bigger and considerably scarier Mi-24s. 2 American-made Black Hawks and 2 American-made MD-500 Defender light attack helicopters are also in the hands of the Taliban. It's not clear whether the Taliban will be able to fly them indefinitely. Their regime is subject to severe arms embargoes that make it very difficult to acquire replacement parts, and they already crashed one of the Mi-17s in 2024. But speaking of 2024, we're a quarter of the way through the 21st century and the Taliban's got an air force. Brilliant.
Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it.
On the far edges of West Asia, we stop in for a quick visit in Armenia, where after a difficult few years losing battles against neighboring Azerbaijan, the Armenian Air Force is in the process of getting a facelift. At present, the centerpiece of the Armenian Air Force are just 4 Russian-made 4th-generation jets, the Sukhoi Su-30. Broadly similar to the MiG-29 in its purpose, the Su-30 is featured in a number of global air forces, although most that rely on it are more advanced than Armenia's. Eventually, Armenia hopes to own 12 of the planes, although the remaining 8 are nowhere to be found. Flying at double the speed of sound and carrying weapons on up to 12 hardpoints, the Su-30 is the sort of jet where even a small handful can make a difference. But for Armenia, they didn't make a difference when a critical moment arrived. During the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war with Azerbaijan, the Su-30s had only recently arrived, and Armenia had no missiles to load onto them. Additionally, Armenia possesses 16 Su-25 aircraft, NATO reporting name Frogfoot, also produced by the Russian Sukhoi company. Although only about 10 of the aircraft are thought to currently be airworthy, they're a meaningful addition to any air arsenal. With over 1,000 Frogfoot aircraft in circulation around the world, they're among the premier ground attack jet aircraft on the globe, beating out more famous attack aircraft like America's A-10 in terms of sheer numbers and rivaling it in terms of overall quality. Flying low and slow, the Frogfoot is built with the intent to devastate tank columns and destroy hardy attacking forces. Armenia's got 24 Mi-27s, the attack and utility helicopters we've been mentioning, and 20 of the larger Mi-24 gunships, and yes, you're right to be picking up on the theme that these two models will often travel together. Among its other relevant aircraft, Armenia doesn't have many strategic airlifters, but the ones it does are some heavy-duty stuff. The country possesses 3 Il-76 aircraft made by Ilyushin Design Bureau in the Soviet Union back in the 1970s. Capable of flying at a range of 4,400 kilometers or 2,700 miles with a heavy payload, the Il-76 can carry a great deal of troops or military equipment. But although Armenia's air force certainly isn't nothing, it still comes up short in the contest that matters most, and Armenia knows it. Against rival Azerbaijan, the country's current kit can't really compete, and although Armenia might pick up a few more Indian-made Su-30s in the next few years, it's not clear that any deal is even close to being finalized. And speaking of West Asian nations, with a more powerful nation on their doorstep, we visit Armenia's neighbor, Georgia. As a nation that's very recently had to deal with Russian tank columns advancing on its capital city, it should be no surprise that the most important aircraft of Georgia's air wing is the Frogfoot, the same ground attack aircraft that Armenia keeps in its arsenal. The trouble, however, is that it's only got 4 of the aircraft, including 2 currently in storage, and recently lost a 5th that crashed in the summer of this year. Its attack helicopter arsenal is similarly limited, 15 Mi-8s, 9 Mi-24 gunships, and not much else. It's got a few of the Czech light attack jets that we referenced earlier, the Il-39 Albatross, and unlike other countries that use the Albatross exclusively for training purposes, Georgia is one of those that could strap weapons onto it and use it for defense if need be. But with just 8 at its disposal, plus those 2 Frogfoot aircraft ready to fly, Georgia's air wing leaves quite a bit to be desired. Unlike Armenia, however, it's not likely that Georgia will pick up new kit anytime soon. Politically, the country is increasingly aligned to a group called the Georgian Dream Party, whose approach to Russia is alternately described as appeasement or outright collaboration, depending on who you ask. For however long Georgian Dream holds power in the country, it's unlikely that Georgia will acquire hardware that could help defend it against its most formidable nearby adversary. From West Asia, we travel southward to the Middle East to take a look at a nation that's certainly on the smaller side for the region, and that nation is Bahrain, a little Gulf state that faces few direct threats to its sovereignty. Bahrain is a US ally, and a big part of why it doesn't need to worry much about domestic threats is America's Fifth Fleet, a naval fleet that bases itself on Bahraini soil. Considering that the air power of the Fifth Fleet by itself is enough to turn many nations into the distant memory of a nation, Bahrain doesn't need too much of its own kit, but it does have some hardware regardless. The centerpiece of the Bahraini Air Force is the American-made F-16, technically known as the Fighting Falcon, but informally bearing the much cooler, less clunky name, the Viper. With well over 2,000 F-16s operational, it is the world's most common fixed-wing military aircraft, and Bahrain is responsible for 18 of them, specifically the single-seat F-16C. In addition to the C's enhanced radar, cockpit avionics, and hardpoints, it features all the other multi-role capability of an F-16, more than capable of serving as an interceptor, an air superiority fighter, a ground attack aircraft, or anything else based on its loadout. Travelling at a bit over double the speed of sound and featuring a combat range that more than does the job for little Bahrain, the F-16 is simply not an aircraft to be messed with. In the coming years, Bahrain hopes to replace its 18 C models with another 18 F-16s under the much more sophisticated V model. Besides the F-16s, Bahrain flies 22 copies of the AH-1 Cobra, a US-made attack helicopter that saw first service all the way back in the Vietnam era. A capable gunship, the AH-1 is small, nimble, and currently flying with a handful of global air forces. Alongside the AH-1, they've got another 12 of the more advanced AH-1Zs, a later model of the same basic aircraft that first went into military service anywhere in the year 2010. It's one of the world's most advanced attack helos, and Bahrain is one of only 3 nations to fly out alongside the Czech Republic and the Marine Corps of the United States. In the near term, Bahrain is considering the purchase of an additional 24 surplus attack helicopters, while in the long term, it's already thinking about how it might replace its new F-16V variant. A range of European fourth-generation aircraft are up for consideration, along with the American F-35. From the Middle East, we turn to Latin America, where we'll begin with the Central American nation of Honduras. Like Bahrain's attack helicopters, the central fixed-wing aircraft in Honduras's arsenal is a piece of Vietnam-era technology, the relatively antiquated light attack aircraft known as the A-37 Dragonfly. Produced by the Cessna Corporation for counterinsurgent operations, the Dragonfly is a firmly subsonic jet, flying at no more than 816 kilometers per hour or 507 miles an hour. But with a low stall speed of just 182 kilometers or 112 miles per hour and a decent combat range of 460 miles or 740 kilometers, the Dragonfly is a solid piece of ground attack hardware even today, and it comes complete with rockets, bombs, and missiles. Honduras flies 9 of the jets and uses them for local defense and border patrol. To fulfill a fighter jet role, Honduras also possesses 4 Northrop F-5 fighters, a fellow Cold War jet that first entered service all the way back in 1964. Fast, nimble, and featuring a decent range and collection of hardpoints, the F-5 is a favorite of Air Forces operating older kit, although they're certainly nearing the end of their service lives in most places where they fly. Most of Honduras's other airworthy crafts aren't much better to look at, but the more interesting story is just how much their air force has downsized in recent years. Since the 1980s, they've phased out most of their F-5s, all their tactical airlifters, and a handful of Spanish-made attack jets, the Casa Aviojet. Those aircraft do not appear likely to be replaced. Further south, we get to the nation of Venezuela, where traditionally hypothetical questions like would America's or Russia's premier fighter aircraft win in a dogfight can easily be answered within the confines of their own air force. It's difficult to say just how many of Venezuela's combat aircraft are flyable, owing to stiff sanctions against the country via much of the world and a stunning wave of emigration of experts and knowledgeable personnel from the country. But at least in theory, Venezuela counts 34 fighter aircraft in its arsenal, 13 American-made F-16s and 30 Russian-made Su-30s. Both multi-role fighters, both generally regarded as being around the qualitative average among fourth-generation aircraft worldwide, the smaller and more nimble F-16 is actually quite a nice tactical pair with the larger, heavier payload Su-30, at least in an ideal world. Both aircraft share a similar top speed, each of them can carry all sorts of weaponry that the other could not, and the Su-30 can outperform the F-16 in range and sheer carrying capacity, while the F-16 is better equipped to meet incoming threats at close range. While Venezuela's F-16s are old models and their spare parts have been embargoed, they're able to replenish and refurbish their Su-30 fleet as needed. For a relatively small air force, Venezuela also happens to have a couple of interesting assets not intended for direct combat. In addition to several C-130 strategic airlifters, Venezuela is in possession of an American-made Boeing 707 fitted for in-air refueling duties. Not only that, but they've got an electronic warfare plane using the base model of the commercial propeller plane, the Fairchild Metroliner. Because all three aircraft are US models, they're also under embargo for spare parts, as are 10 Eurocopter transport helicopters. Nonetheless, Venezuela intends to pick up 10 Mi-28 gunships from Russia relatively soon, and it's got 6 smaller dual-purpose Mi-17s at its disposal as well. Unfortunately for Venezuela, but also fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the only time in recent history that the Venezuelan Air Force has gotten a workout is during a coup d'etat attempt in 1992. Warplanes bombarded targets in the capital city of Caracas and destroyed several of their fellow fighter jets, but have been inactive ever since. But if Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro decides to make good on his recent threats to invade neighboring Guyana, then his existing air arsenal should do the job. And now, pivoting to Africa, we get to the predominantly desert nation of Botswana, just north of the South African border. Botswana doesn't fly much, but what it does fly, for combat purposes, are a pack of 11 Canadair CF5s, a licensed version of the more popular and widespread F5. As of now, Botswana is the only country in the world still operating the CF5, a relatively high-powered aircraft that entered military service back in 1968. Capable of flight at a top speed of Mach 1.3, that's 1,575 kilometers or 978 miles per hour, the CF5 can carry only limited air-to-air munitions, but a wider array of rocket pods and bombs. Locally, the planes are referred to as BF5s, B for Botswana. Elsewhere in its arsenal, Botswana flies 4 American-made C-130s, alongside the usual odds and ends that one might expect from a smaller, regional-capable transport and trainer aircraft. Right next to Botswana, the South African military is a good deal more advanced, as one might expect from a nation with nearly 20 times the GDP of Botswana. But for two nations with such a considerable wealth disparity, South Africa isn't nearly as advanced as you'd expect, and in fact, we've got to include it in the little guy section. Insofar as its combat aircraft are concerned, South Africa flies just 26 of the lead aircraft in its arsenal, with only 17 of them intended to actually serve in combat. Those 17 are copies of the Swedish-made JAS-39 Gripen, an advanced fourth-generation fighter that's drawn considerable acclaim from operators around the world. South Africa's Gripens are NATO-compatible, featuring advanced electronics and in-flight refueling capabilities, and they'll be coming back over the course of this episode as a fixture of air forces that lean on it to be at the top end of the fourth-generation fighter spectrum, while not being as costly as a fifth-generation stealth fighter. It's very fast, it can be armed to the teeth with a variety of air-to-air, air-to-grounds, and anti-ship missiles, and its technology on par with most 21st century aircraft. Backing up its 17 Gripens, South Africa flies 24 copies of the Hawk, a British-made aircraft that does double duty as a trainer and a light combat aircraft in the event that is needed. Unlike the Gripen, the Hawk cannot go supersonic unless taken into a dive, and it can't carry that much in the way of armament across its 5 hardpoints. But it can do the job as a close air support jet or a patrolling interceptor against adversaries that aren't particularly sophisticated. South Africa operates 2 electronic warfare jets, a version of the Cessna 208 Grand Caravan we mentioned earlier, and a heavily modified version of the Douglas DC-3, a twin-propeller aircraft that took its first flight in 1941. 6 more DC-3s fill a role in South Africa's Air Force, including 3 that do maritime patrol. South Africa flies half a dozen American-made C-130s, and it's got its own attack helicopters, an indigenously designed model known as the Denel Ruurwerk, an Afrikaans word meaning red falcon. Based on a French helicopter known as the Puma, the Ruurwerk had a short production line with just 15 copies ever made, and 11 of them still flying today. But with the potential to carry up to 16 anti-tank missiles or 76 rockets each, they're also not an aircraft that anybody should want to run into during wartime. Unfortunately for the South African Air Force, the branch is badly underfunded and has trouble getting enough pilots, spare parts, and maintenance staff to actually make its air fleet flyable. In late 2021, every single one of South Africa's Gripens were grounded, meaning that in real terms, Botswana's Air Force to the north could probably put the country to shame. Further north, but still within sub-Saharan Africa, the Air Force of the nation of Gabon could also deal with a completely grounded fleet of Gripens, but they might need a couple of attack runs to do it. Gabon flies just 6 copies of the Mirage F1, a French fighter and attack aircraft that the world was first introduced to in 1973. Taking over for the Mirage 3 family of fighters, the F1 served in the French Air Force all the way through till 2014, making them a considerable force to be reckoned with in environments like sub-Saharan Africa, where there's less air power to go around. That is, however, pretty much the extent of the Gabonese Air Force at present, aside from a small handful of light attack helicopters and transport planes. And last on our tour of the world's minor air forces, we travel to Europe, where the first item to touch on is the non-NATO nation of Ireland. At present, the Irish Air Corps possesses a grand total of 0 combat aircraft, although it's got a not insignificant collection of patrol and reconnaissance aircraft. Ireland's aware of the problem that this poses. After all, Ireland has learned, along with the rest of Europe, that it simply cannot rely on a world order where there's no need for national defense apparatus. But it's also pushed off the deadline to make even a decision about whether it needs combat aircraft until 2028, by which time much of Europe hopes to be already midway into a defense renaissance. There are a few candidates for Ireland to consider: the American F-16, the Swedish Gripen that we just discussed for South Africa, and the Korean-made T-50 Golden Eagle, a nominally designated trainer aircraft that can very handily do double duty in a light combat role. But as of now, Ireland has yet to even operate a single combat aircraft in the 21st century, having retired its last combat-capable Magister in 1999. Even the Magister wasn't much to look at, with a top speed of 715 kilometers or 444 miles per hour and a grand total of 140 kilograms or 310 pounds of payload capacity, and an intended role as a trainer aircraft. Elsewhere in Europe, there are a few national air forces that make it clear just why these nations would be so happy to be under the collective defense umbrella of the NATO alliance. To that end, we'll run through a handful of them quickly. Lithuania's got an air force that includes slightly more than 0 aircraft, including 3 copies of the Spartan, a tactical airlifter built by the Italian company Leonardo. Immediately northward, Latvia has 3 American-made Black Hawk helicopters to its name, with a 4th on the way, and by the way, Lithuania's picking up 4 of them too. Unfortunately, the remainder of the Latvian Air Force consists of 2 ultralight prop trains to do basic air training and 3 Soviet-era biplanes of the Antonov AN-2 line, first produced in 1947. Rounding out the Baltics, Estonia also has exactly 0 designated combat aircraft, although its 2 L-39 Albatros aircraft could technically fire weapons if need be. They did recently phase out their Soviet biplanes, however, and have replaced them with a considerably more capable short-range airlifter. Finally, NATO member North Macedonia at least has flying aircraft intended to shoot things in the form of 8 of the Soviet heavy gunship choppers that we mentioned earlier, the MiL Mi-24, and a smaller number of Mi-17s. Notably not unique, North Macedonia has gone to the trouble of indicating that it will never pursue the acquisition of jet fighter aircraft, openly acknowledging its intent to rely on allies indefinitely for the security of its airspace. Now, as we wrap up our list of the little guys, it should be clear that not all of the little guys are created equal. While, say, the Air Force of Bangladesh flies considerably more combat jets than the Air Force of Bahrain, it's the Bahraini Air Force that would almost certainly get the edge in head-to-head combat. Technological sophistication matters, training quality matters, the ability to source replacement parts and carry out regular maintenance also matters. But make no mistake, regardless of who might be able to give who a shellacking if ever one was necessary, these are still among the small air forces of the world. And as we start moving into the territory of even local powers, the size of force we're discussing is about to increase dramatically. First up, let's travel to the nation of Malaysia, where the Royal Malaysian Air Force brings both the technical sophistication and the variety to stand up alongside most air forces in the region. Taking into account yet unfulfilled orders, Malaysia counts 4 models of dedicated air combat aircraft in its arsenal, starting with one that we haven't yet touched on, the Hornet. Made in the United States, primarily for the use of the US Navy, the FA-18 Hornet is the pride of most air forces in which it serves. Malaysia keeps 8 of the aircraft around, all twin-seater updated models, but not the Super Hornet version that a tiny group of global air forces take immense pride in flying. Alongside the Hornet, Malaysia flies 18 copies of a plane we've referenced several times already, the Russian-made Sukhoi Su-30. Malaysia flies a dozen of the British-made Hawk aircraft we referenced in the arsenal of South Africa, although these ones are outfitted specifically for a combat role. Finally, Malaysia is waiting on an incoming order of 18 Korean-made T-50s, the same Golden Eagle aircraft we just spoke about in reference to Ireland. Capable of hitting a top speed of Mach 1.5 and carrying up to 5,400 kilograms or 12,000 pounds of ordnance, the Golden Eagle is rapidly becoming a favorite of global air forces in an unusually quick series of pickups after it went on the export market in the early 2000s. Alongside its 4 types of jet fighter, Malaysia flies 4 aerial refueling tankers, all adapted models based on America's C-130. It leverages 10 copies of the base C-130 for tactical airlift, in addition to 4 Airbus tactical airlifters, the A400M, better known as the Alice. Just to the north, Thailand and its Royal Thai Air Force have a similar variety of combat aircraft to their name in an even greater number. That includes several dozen F-16s and 11 combat-ready Swedish Gripens, with up to 14 newer model Gripen fighters coming in soon to replace some of the older F-16s in Thailand's air wing. The country also fields a squadron of F-5 fighters capable of keeping pace and serving in a backup role behind either of Thailand's more advanced options. They fly 18 copies of the Alpha Jet, a jointly developed German and French aircraft in a light attack role. Capable of serving as either an attack jet or an advanced trainer, the Alpha Jet is subsonic, hitting maximum speeds of 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles per hour, but it can fly low and slow, handling up to 12 times the force of gravity in tight maneuvers and executing short takeoffs and landings while carrying ample weaponry to ruin somebody's day. Finally, Thailand is in the process of procuring another light attack aircraft, the propeller-powered AT-6 Texan II. Flying into service in various air forces since 2001, the Texan II is typically used as a trainer aircraft, but Thailand will use the majority of them to carry weapons into limited engagements. Elsewhere in its arsenal, Thailand is the first nation on our journey today to leverage airborne early warning and control aircraft. It's got 2 of them, each granting large-scale situational awareness over an entire battlefield. But while Thailand is also the first nation on our list to boast an aircraft carrier, that carrier does not fly any fixed-wing combat aircraft. Moving on from Southeast Asia, let's stop over in the post-Soviet nation of Turkmenistan, where the Turkmen Air Force uses an eclectic mix of aircraft to get the job done. In rather standard fare, Turkmenistan flies 25 Sukhoi frogfoot aircraft for a primarily ground attack role, much like just about every other nation in the post-Soviet world either does or used to do in prior years. For its air-to-air capabilities, it relies on the multi-role Soviet aircraft, the MiG-29. That is, to recap, a very capable aircraft hitting top speeds of Mach 2.3 or higher, featuring a considerable combat range and carrying all manner of dangerous bits and bobs on its 7 underwing hardpoints. But it also flies an aircraft we haven't yet discussed in this episode, the Italian-made Alenia Airmacchi M346 Master, a small, twin-engine aircraft that typically functions as a trainer, but Turkmenistan uses the Master in a combat role. That way, Turkmenistan can take advantage of its considerable subsonic speeds and its non-insubstantial armament for an aircraft of that size. The nation's got 5 combat-ready Master aircraft, plus 2 on order for training purposes, along with 25 estimated Su-25s and 24 estimated MiG-29s. But Turkmenistan also flies 5 copies of an aircraft we haven't talked about since Afghanistan, the A-29 Super Tucano. Those long-range, very rugged, and highly reliable prop planes are more than fit to watch over Turkmenistan's vast empty expanses, which make up a large proportion of the overall country. Turkmenistan relies on both Italian and Soviet airlifters, including the AN-74 with its unique twin-jet engines, sitting mostly above the plane's wings, as if they were a pair of big hulking shoulders. Turkmenistan leverages 10 Soviet-made Mi-24 helicopter gunships, plus 15 smaller Mi-17s, and it's among the few nations we've discussed so far to integrate drones not just for reconnaissance, but for combat. Turkmenistan flies at least 6 Turkish-made Bayraktar drones, the TB2, capable of autonomous flight operations and proven in combat everywhere from Ukraine to Ethiopia to Armenia and Azerbaijan. From Asia, we'll cycle to the Middle East and North Africa, starting all the way back on the Atlantic coast with Morocco. In total, Morocco's got 70 fixed-wing combat aircraft to its name, including 23 F-16s, 22 older F-5s, and 25 French-made Mirage F-1s. With those 3 fighters taken together, the Royal Moroccan Air Force is more than capable of covering the broad span of its combat needs, considering that all 3 designs serve multi-role functions, but each have clear specializations in a given area. Morocco is looking to upgrade its F-16 fleet very soon, bringing in 25 of these significantly more advanced F-16V. Also in the sky, Morocco flies 2 airborne early warning and control planes, soon raising that total to 4, along with a pair of converted French business jets that are optimized to collect electronic and signals intelligence. Morocco flies a total of 20 American C-130s and Italian C-27Js for its tactical airlift purposes, with 2 of those C-130s fitted for aerial refueling and 1 to collect signals intelligence. But we're getting to the time in this episode where just about everybody we discussed will have at least a few major tactical airlift planes. As a result, please know that we're just going to stop mentioning them now unless they serve roles outside tactical airlift. As a military that deals with a long-running low-grade insurgency in the Western Sahara, Morocco possesses a substantial attack helicopter component to its air fleet, including 19 French-made Gazelle choppers, an older design that first saw service in 1973. It's also in the process of picking up 24 copies of America's famed Apache helicopter, a chopper introduced in the 1980s but still very much relied on around the world, with some 5,000 deliveries of the aircraft to global customers at the time of writing. In its UAV wing, Morocco flies several types of combat drone, including the American-made MQ-9 Reaper, the French-Israeli Hafung, the Turkish TB2 and Akinci, and the Chinese Winglong. From Morocco, we turn to an air force that's gotten a substantial workout over the last decade plus, and that is Syria, where a raging civil war has soaked up ordnance from airstrikes since all the way back in 2011. Syria's arsenal, at the time of writing, it's pretty tough to pin down since its air losses aren't always carefully catalogued and there are open questions on what exactly is still in flying condition. But at least on paper, Syria's got some pretty substantial kit, with nearly all of it hailing from Soviet Russia. At the tip of the spear are 29 MiG-29s, including numerous upgraded aircraft that feature an extended range, the capacity to carry air-to-ground weapons, and the option to graft on non-Russian avionics, and more. But the bulk of Syria's fighter arsenal is made up of older MiG aircraft, including nearly 90 copies of the MiG-23. First introduced to service in 1970, the swing-wing MiG-23 was a very popular aircraft in its day, although today it only flies with a small handful of global air forces. Capable of flight at Mach 2.35 at altitude, with an impressive combat range and a decent capacity to carry ordnance, it's a respectable aircraft when turned against the sorts of ground-based insurgencies that Syria has dealt with for the last decade and a half. Syria also flies 50 MiG-21s, introduced to Soviet service all the way back in the 1950s, and just 2 copies of the MiG-25, a high-powered interceptor that can hit speeds of up to Mach 2.83, that's 3,000 kilometers an hour, 1,900 miles per hour, which is one of the fastest military aircraft to ever fly. For its ground attack needs, Syria relies primarily on 18 Sukhoi Su-24s, a close cousin of the Su-25 Frogfoot. Like its fellow fighter aircraft in Syrian service, the Su-24 is a swing-wing aircraft featuring the capacity to reach combat zones at high speeds while flying low and slow on attack. It's got a substantial carrying capacity with all sorts of rockets, air-to-ground missiles, and bombs able to be mounted on 9 hardpoints. Backing those up are nearly 40 Su-22s, a relic of the far Soviet past with a full 12 hardpoints at its owner's disposal. Elsewhere in its arsenal, Syria flies over 100 attack helicopters of varying kinds, including 27 heavy Mi-24 gunships and 62 copies of the light Gazelle scout chopper, coming by way of France. All in all, the Syrian Air Force is believed to have launched many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of individual attacks during the Syrian civil war, making it one of the most battle-tested air forces in the modern world. And right next to Syria, we stop in with the Iraqi Air Force, where recent American backing intermingles with evidence of a different critical backer in decades gone by. Iraq flies a total of 32 F-16s, 24 of which are intended for a combat role, along with 2 copies of the up-armored Cessna that we mentioned in regard to Afghanistan, the Combat Caravan. But these American designs fly alongside 19 Su-25 Frogfoot attack aircraft, 14 of which are intended for combat, as well as 10 light attack versions of the L-159 Albatross. In a relative sense, it's a rather sparse air force for a nation that was just recently fighting against a massive land-holding caliphate, although its dependence on US and coalition air power goes some way in explaining the deficit. But it's in Iraq that we find the first mention of a top-tier 4th-generation fighter jet that will become more common as we go along. The French-made Rafale, designed by Dassault Engineering. First introduced to service in 2001, the Dassault is still a relatively rare fighter jet in global arsenals, with somewhere between 260 and 280 produced at the time of writing. But it's also among the most in-demand fighter aircraft on the planet today, owing to its prowess as what its designers call an omni-role 4.5 generation aircraft. Capable of serving in air supremacy, interception, reconnaissance, ground attack, anti-ship, anti-nuclear, and a range of other mission roles, the Rafale is confirmed for eventual delivery to a number of world nations, including Iraq, which is waiting on 12 of the fighters at the time of writing. Featuring a mind-boggling 14 external hardpoints, the Delta Wing Rafale is expected to become the centerpiece of the Iraqi Air Force, as it will in several nations that we're yet to touch on. From the Middle East, let's head over to Latin America, where we'll begin with the island nation of Cuba. There, the Cuban Revolutionary Air and Air Defense Force boasts an illustrious history as what used to be the most powerful air force in all of Latin America. That air force, however, happens to be frozen in time, and it's an open question just how much of Cuba's kit is still flyable. Typically considered among Cuba's flyable aircraft are a grand total of 3 MiG-29s, serving as the absolute apex aircraft that the country can offer. These MiG-29s are older Soviet-era models lacking the upgrades of later editions. Backing them up are 23 swing-wing MiG-23 fighters, along with 11 of the considerably more antiquated MiG-21s. Cuba flies 14 attack helicopters, including 4 Mi-24 gunships and a full 26 copies of the L-39, which, depending on the combat readiness of Cuba's other fighters, might actually be the most dangerous aircraft in the Cuban arsenal. Its Albatross aircraft, however, are outfitted for training duty. Further south, we turn to the Peruvian Air Force, where the MiG-29 also features prominently as the only air superiority fighter in Peru's arsenal. Peru flies 6 of the aircraft, although only 4 are combat ready. They are accompanied, in the event of hostilities, by 11 flyable copies of an older French aircraft, the Mirage 2000. Peru used to have 12 until one crashed in April of 2024. Powerful, capable, and ready to serve in the full capacity of a multi-role aircraft, the Delta Wing Mirage 2000 is a common sight in global air forces, although Peru's detachment of 11 is the smallest number flying among nations that still have the 2000 in service. It's able to hit speeds of Mach 2.2 at high altitude with an impressive range and 9 hardpoints with a respectable carrying capacity of 6,300 kilograms or nearly 14,000 pounds. Alongside the MiG-29 and the Mirage 2000, Peru flies 5 Su-25 Frogfoot attack aircraft and 20 copies of an aircraft that we haven't mentioned in a while, the A-37 Dragonfly, built by the American Cessna Corporation. A small, slow-flying attack aircraft with only a modest capacity to carry ordnance, they are nonetheless an important plane in an air force used to fighting asymmetric insurgencies and limited border wars. The non-combat portion of Peru's air wing offers a few items of interest. The nation flies 2 aerial refueling tankers based on the American-made C-130, and it flies 3 American-made Metroliners, a rapid response military jet that's used primarily for anti-drug operations. It flies 16 Mi-24 gunships and plans to acquire a total of 17 other attack helicopters, also Soviet models. But the real story on the Peruvian Air Force is its push toward imminent modernization. The vast majority of Peru's on-paper aircraft are not ready to fly. But in October of 2024, the nation set aside the equivalent of $3.5 billion to pick up 24 cutting-edge fighters. The precise aircraft that Peru will eventually settle on, not even its highest officials know for sure, but 3 aircraft are currently up for discussion. The upgraded F-16V of American design, the JAS-39 Gripen from Sweden, or the latest model of the Rafale from France, any of which would put Peru miles ahead of most Latin American nations. Eastward, we go to Argentina, where for a nation with the 3rd largest GDP in all of Latin America and the Caribbean, one would think that Buenos Aires would field a good bit more flying hardware than it actually does. As of now, Argentina's best fighter aircraft are 11 copies of the American-made A4 Fighting Hawk, 8 of which are in fighting condition. One additional Fighting Hawk was lost in 2024. An Argentina-specific upgrade of the A4 Skyhawk, which first entered service all the way back in 1956, the Fighting Hawk is a newer aircraft, entering Argentine service in 1997. But although it integrates the F-16's avionics, it's not a particularly fearsome aircraft, hitting top speeds of just 1,080 kilometers per hour or 671 miles per hour, and carrying weaponry on just 5 external hardpoints. Coming in its A4s, Argentina flies 15 indigenously produced Pampa attack aircraft, a heavily modified plane based on the German-French Alpha jet. First introduced in 1988, the Pampa is slower and carries significantly less ordnance than the A4. Argentina flies a pair of refueling aircraft, a handful of light utility and attack helicopters, and not much else. But the nation intends to change that reality very soon, when it will welcome 24 F-16s to its arsenal, courtesy of Denmark. Even these aircraft, however, are considerably less advanced than the F-16s rolling off the production line today, meaning that even with its new Vipers, Argentina will be significantly behind the global standard for a nation of its relative wealth and power. And perhaps, to the chagrin of some Argentines, the nation's air power is even outmatched by that of neighboring Chile. The country flies a full 46 F-16s, 35 of which are ready to serve in a combat role, and most of those planes are significantly more advanced models than the ones Argentina will be getting from Denmark. Also flying in Chile's defense are 10 relatively modernized copies of the American-made F-5, capable of firing advanced versions of the Python air-to-air missile Chile relies on, and leveraging upgraded radar. These, by themselves, are enough to outstrip Argentina's capabilities, but they aren't all that's in Chile's arsenal. The nation flies 3 copies of the vaunted KC-135 Strato tanker, an aircraft that first entered service with the US in 1957, but remains the gold standard for global in-air refueling. It's also the first air force on our list today to fly the Boeing E-3 Sentry, of which Chile flies 3, provided by the British Air Force. A significantly upgraded version of the Boeing 707, topped with a massive rotating radar dome, the E-3 provides all-weather command, control, and surveillance capability to the nations that fly it, granting said nations a far greater situational awareness across their chosen battle space. The nation also flies 22 Embraer A29 Super Tucanos, and although they fill a training role for Chile, they're more than capable of serving in combat if need be. Traveling on to Africa, we find ourselves discussing another nation currently at war, Sudan. Like the other active conflict nations that we've referenced thus far, we've got to emphasize that the pre-war accounting of Sudan's warplanes may not reflect combat losses during the country's ongoing civil war. Sudan's is another one of those air forces that harkens back to the Soviet era, but in this case, much of the country's kit actually hails from China. Sudan flies 20 Chengdu J-7s, a license-built Chinese version of the MiG-21, backed up by about 8 Shenyang J-6s, a copy of the even older Soviet MiG-19. The nation also leverages 20 copies of the Chinese A-5, an export version of an adapted ground attack aircraft based on the MiG-19. Used for close air support and flying in military service since 1970, the A-5 only flies in 2 global air forces today, although with 10 hardpoints and the potential to fly a bit faster than the speed of sound, it still packs a punch against less equipped adversaries. Alongside its Chinese-made fleet, Sudan flies 4 MiG-21s of Soviet manufacture plus 3 high-powered but outdated MiG-23s, while the most powerful asset of its air fleet is a set of 9 MiG-29s. For ground attack, in keeping with most Soviet-sourced air forces, Sudan flies the Su-24 and the Su-25 with 9 combat-ready jets in total. Relative to other air forces of its size, however, Sudan's attack helicopter fleet is quite overpowered, no fewer than 35 Mi-24 heavy gunships. Across Sudan's southeastern border, Ethiopia's air force is a good bit smaller, but arguably capable of going toe-to-toe on its technological merit. Ethiopia flies 14 combat-ready Sukhoi-made Su-27s, a twin-engine, super-maneuverable, multi-role fighter aircraft that was built to rival America's F-15 Eagle. Broadly similar in combat role and sophistication to the MiG-29, the Su-27 features a highly impressive range for a fighter aircraft, plus the ability to carry ordnance on 10 hardpoints while crashing through the air at Mach 2.35. The Su-27's highly successful airframe has spawned a range of later edition jets, including the Su-30, of which Ethiopia will eventually acquire a total of 6. The Su-30 is a heavy interceptor rift on its predecessor. Alongside those aircraft, Ethiopia flies 2 combat-ready copies of the Su-25 Frogfoot for ground attack, along with 9 copies of the swing-wing MiG-23 fighter bomber. In a common refrain at this stage in our deep dive, Ethiopia flies 6 Mi-24 heavy gunships, while it also boasts a collection of several types of Turkish, Chinese, and Iranian-made drones. Like Sudan, the Ethiopian Air Force has gotten quite a bit of work in during the last few decades, although it's suffered several losses of fighter aircraft, helicopters, and more. Moving across the continent, we reach Nigeria, where an eclectic air force draws combat aircraft from France, China, Pakistan, and Brazil in unison. The 3 fighter jets that form the heart of the Nigerian Air Force are of a make and model that we haven't yet discussed. The JF-17 Thunder, a single-engine, multi-role, 4th-generation aircraft jointly developed by China and Pakistan but manufactured by the latter. Built to produce a wide range of aircraft in Pakistani service, the JF-17 is a lightweight aircraft meant to rival the F-16 in capabilities while cutting costs in half. Flying at a top speed of Mach 1.6, the JF-17 is excellent in a ground attack role owing to an exceptionally low stall speed for an interceptor-capable aircraft. It can carry 4 metric tons of payload on 8 hardpoints, and it can carry ordnance that most nations near Nigeria couldn't dream of strapping onto an aircraft. Flying into battle behind Nigeria's trio of JF-17s, the country flies 11 Chengdu J-7s, the Chinese-produced version of the MiG-21. It flies 12 A-29 Super Tucanos for attack and close air support, particularly in counterinsurgent operations against Boko Haram and a range of other rebel groups all across the country. It also flies 12 copies of the Alpha Jet, an aircraft that we mentioned previously, but didn't really dig into. It's a Cold War-era jet that entered service in 1977, and it was a favourite of both France and West Germany in its heyday, doing double duty as a light attack jet and an advanced trainer aircraft. In Nigerian service, the Alpha Jet was built for combat, and it's worked with high competence across the last several decades as part of Nigeria's counterinsurgent operations. Carrying decent amounts of ordnance across 5 hardpoints, the Alpha Jet is solidly subsonic, but can fly precise attack runs while flying at a respectable range. Elsewhere in its arsenal, Nigeria flies 15 Mi-24 gunships, eventually looking to field 33 in total. It's also invested in 6 Turkish T-129 attack helicopters optimized for operations in rugged terrain and very warm climates, along with 12 incoming copies of the American-made Bell Viper. All right, heading onwards to Europe, we'll settle in on a close Russian ally and a post-Soviet nation where the legacy of Soviet air power is still alive and well. That nation, of course, is Belarus, where despite a fairly standard post-Soviet arsenal, the decision-makers in Minsk have distinguished their air force in one particular way, a quite frankly disproportionate share of attack aircraft. Belarus fields no fewer than 65 Su-25 Frogfoot aircraft in a combat role, a number that's nearly double the count of its premier air-to-air and multi-role fighter, the MiG-29. Belarus flies 33 MiG-29s, 13 of which have been brought up to a relatively modern standard. The country also flies a small handful of somewhat more sophisticated Su-30s, intending to pick up a total of 12 by the time all is said and done. Between its eventual 100-plus combat jets and 25 Mi-24 helicopter gunships, the Belarusian Air Force is, in some regard, a diet version of the Russian Air Force that we'll dive into near the end of today's episode. Also on the list of non-NATO nations in Europe, we turn to Serbia, currently in the process of upgrading its air wing to a standard on par with its neighbours. Serbia is one of the few nations in Europe to rely on the MiG-29, 11 of which fly for Serbia in a combat role. But it's also the only nation in the world to fly a Yugoslav aircraft, the J-22 Arao, introduced to military service in 1978. A high supersonic aircraft, the J-22 is capable of hitting Mach 0.96 in level flight, but is intended to cross the sound barrier by taking short dives. Although it's a relatively low-range aircraft carrying a low amount of ordnance, the J-22 proved itself capable of attack runs during multiple Balkan conflicts. Owing to the aircraft's age, however, Serbia is looking to replace it, and very recently, the nation inked a deal with France to acquire a dozen highly sophisticated Rafales. The deal generated some controversy in France, owing to ongoing concerns about whether or not Serbia might be looking to start a war in the next few years, but as of now, it's expected to move forward. Serbia flies 15 Mi-24 helicopter gunships, plus 25 Gazelle scout choppers, and alongside a handful of Chinese combat UAVs, Serbia flies 12 indigenously produced Pegaz combat drones, with more on the way. Rounding out Europe's non-NATO nations in this particular section, we come to a nation that would very much like to be a member of NATO, and that's of course Ukraine. Now, at this point in our deep dive, you've heard this caveat before, but you've got to hear it again. Ukraine is party to an active major conflict, and although its air combat losses are tracked with considerably greater attention than most air forces in such a position, the true extent of its surviving inventory is just not known. But, at the very least, we can speak in general terms about what Ukraine possessed prior to the start of the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022. At that time, Ukraine's air force resembled that of the other post-Soviet nations that we've discussed thus far, spearheaded by about 40 advanced MiG-29 multi-role fighters and 25 or so of the MiG-29's cousin from the Sukhoi Design Bureau, the Su-27. Backing up those 65-odd fighter jets were roughly 15 Su-25 Frogfoot aircraft and about the same number of Su-24s. Those aircraft were accompanied by a handful of utility helicopters that could double in an attack role and about 45 Albatross training aircraft, which can, as we've seen, fulfill a combat role if need be. But since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began in force, the question of expansion for Ukraine's air force has been a matter of considerable international discussion. At the time of writing, Ukraine is anticipated to boast a far more sophisticated air force in a few years' time, led by roughly 80, if not even more, American-made F-16s. Roughly 10 of those aircraft are already in Ukraine's possession, and the rest are being prepared for delivery after having been donated by various NATO member nations. Although many of those aircraft are older model F-16s, a fair proportion have been upgraded or were purchased new by their initial buyers more recently. Backing up the F-16 will be an unspecified number of Mirage 2000 aircraft awaiting transfer from France. Finally, Ukraine is awaiting on a pair of Saab 340 advanced early warning and control aircraft donated courtesy of Sweden. Featuring a large top-mounted radar using the IRA system, the Saab 340 will grant Ukraine considerable situational awareness that it currently lacks. While there's been some speculation in the defense world that Ukraine would benefit from acquiring either American-made A-10 Warthog attack jets or Swedish Gripen fighters, neither are currently expected to be part of the country's arsenal in the future. There are too few Gripens in circulation for them to come to Ukraine's aid as efficiently as the F-16, and the Warthog, formidable as it may be, simply doesn't fit Ukraine's actual needs on the battlefield. Now, before we depart from Europe, we'll touch on a handful of NATO air forces of around this size to see what the alliance's relatively smaller members are flying. The Belgian Air Force flies a total of 45 American-made F-16s, although, as of now, at least 30 of those F-16s are slated to transfer into Ukrainian hands over the next few years. They'll be replaced by an aircraft that we'll discuss at length later, but that simply requires no introduction, the 5th-generation F-35 Lightning. One of the aircraft is currently in Belgian hands out of an anticipated 34. The Portuguese Air Force also relies on the F-16, flying a total of 24 in a combat role, and it too plans to transition to the F-35. It's also slated to acquire an unspecified number of Super Tucano light attack aircraft at some point in the near future. The Czech Republic relies on 12 Swedish Gripen aircrafts on lease from the Swedish Air Force and, unsurprisingly, backs up its Gripens with 16 light attack versions of the Czech-produced L-159 Alka. The L-159 is basically a 21st century upgrade of the L-39 Albatros series that we've been referencing. The Czechs intend to take possession of 24 F-35s, along with a total of 10 Bell AH-1Z attack helicopters, also coming from the United States. Croatia actually has next to zero combat aircraft right now after wrapping up the retirement process for 40 elderly MiG-21 aircraft, but it's in the process of taking possession of a dozen French Rafales to replace them, while also leveraging 15 copies of America's Bell OH-58, a light attack helicopter that entered service in 1969. Finally, Bulgaria flies a total of 11 MiG-29s in a combat role, plus 5 Su-25 Frogfoot aircraft, but it's in the process of switching over to an aircraft that's significantly better aligned with the NATO standard, 16 relatively modernized copies of the F-16. So, with our considerable list of minor air forces wrapped up, it's time to move on to the somewhat larger scale offerings. The air force is flown by regional powers looking to exert influence as part of global coalitions or be a dominant force when compared to nearby nations. Here, we could start with two nations on opposite sides of the Earth, Canada and Australia. Canada flies 92 operational copies of the American-designed FA-18 Hornet, although the vast majority are Canada's own variant, the CF-18. A highly respected multi-role aircraft, Canada's version of the Hornet is all but equal to the American version in its specifications. The CF-18 pushes a top speed of Mach 1.8 with the capacity to carry over 6,200 kilograms or 14,000 pounds of advanced ordnance on 9 hardpoints. As those aircraft age enough to be phased out, Canada will replace them with 88 copies of the F-35, with all of those copies expected to be in Canadian hands by 2032. The first won't arrive for at least a year at the time of writing. Canada flies a small handful of tanker aircraft, including refitted versions of the Airbus A310 and A330. It's also the first air force on our list to fly the American-made C-17 Globemaster, although in Canada's arsenal it's known as the CC-177. A vaunted strategic airlifter, the C-17 is capable of carrying an entire tank, multiple armoured vehicles, over 100 paratroopers, or most other configurations of a 77,500 kilogram payload that the world's military minds can imagine. That's about 171,000 pounds. The Globemaster can carry it all at a cruising speed of 830 kilometers, 520 miles per hour, flying at a ferry range of 11,500 kilometers or 7,000 miles. Perhaps most impressive of all, it can take off on runways less than a kilometer long, that's 3,000 feet, and land on runways just barely longer than that. Halfway around the world, Australia actually flies a broadly similar arsenal to Canada, relying on 24 relatively well-upgraded copies of the FA-18 for primary air defense and flying several refitted Airbus A330s for its aerial refueling needs, plus 8 C-17 Globemasters. The country used to fly a good deal more, but now it's adopted about 70 copies of the F-35 Lightning to take over air defense and multi-role fighter capabilities. The country expects to eventually fly about 100 of the aircraft and back it up with its indigenously designed AI-powered loyal wingman drones, the MQ-28 Ghostbat by Boeing Australia. The Ghostbat is a hell of a piece of engineering intended to fly alongside manned 5th-generation fighters and perform AI-powered autonomous missions with full independence. Details of the Ghostbat aren't yet fully fleshed out for the public, but Australia currently has orders in for 13 of the drones, with more almost certainly on the way. Not only that, but Australia flies 2 other particularly fancy pieces of kit, the EA-18G Growler and the E-7 Wedgetail. The Growler is an aircraft flown by precisely 2 nations, Australia and the country that built it, the United States. A specialized version of the FA-18F Super Hornet, the Growler is an electronic warfare aircraft capable of jamming radar either at long range or while escorting friendly aircraft. With the Growler in the skies nearby, aircraft are broadly considered safe from the vast majority of surface-to-air projectiles. But if the Growler is already impressive, then the Wedgetail sets a whole other standard. This is another early warning and control aircraft, but it's a particularly sophisticated one, based on the Boeing 737 Next Generation and utilizing a radar antenna that's a generational improvement on the rotating top hats of the American E-3 or Soviet A-50. The Wedgetail provides exceptional situational awareness, integrating capabilities that make it compatible with highly advanced aircraft, and while Australia's 6 copies were initially intended to be the only ones in production, they're now set to be joined by dozens more, set for distribution to several major air forces. From Australia, we move to a far larger air force in South Asia, belonging to the nation of Pakistan. Like several other nations we've discussed, Pakistan merges fighter aircraft developed by several major nations, often on opposing sides of global power struggles. The centerpiece of its air wing, however, is an aircraft we've already mentioned, the JF-17 Thunder. Jointly developed in collaboration with China, Pakistan's JF-17 is both the workhorse of its air fleet and a half-price alternative of the F-16, of which Pakistan operates an additional 75 airframes. In addition to its 2 best air-to-air fighters, Pakistan flies well over 150 French multi-role and attack aircraft, including 87 operational copies of the Mirage 3 and 92 models of the later Mirage 5. Pakistan rounds out its arsenal with 53 dedicated interceptor craft, the Chinese-built J-7 based on the MiG-21. Those J-7s, however, are in the process of being phased out. Finally, Pakistan flies another Chinese model, the J-10 Vigorous Dragon, with the eventual intent of featuring 36 in its air fleet. The J-10 features a delta wing and a powerful engine, pushing it to Mach 1.8 with the ability to carry payload across 11 hardpoints. It's primarily an air superiority fighter meant to directly rival the F-16, although, like the F-16, it can fulfill a range of other combat roles. Pakistan also flies several Saab 2000 early warning and control aircraft, several models of attack helicopter from France, Russia, China, and the US, and a trio of heavily modified French business jets, the Falcon 20, serving in an electronic warfare capacity. Next, we travel to the 38th parallel, where in addition to 2 starkly divergent careers, we find 2 starkly divergent Korean air forces. We'll start off in the north with the Korean People's Army Air Force. Owing to similar international sanctions to those Cuba has dealt with, the North Korean Air Force is a combination of combat air wing and museum. But in terms of sheer volume, it's got a hell of a lot more at its disposal than Cuba does. On paper, the most capable combat jet in North Korea's arsenal is the MiG-29, of which it's thought to possess 35 airframes at the time of writing. Those 35 are joined by 56 copies of the older MiG-23 fighter bomber and 26 MiG-21 interceptors. Its MiG-21s are accompanied by 120 airframe copies of China's version of the same aircraft, the J-7, as well as nearly 100 older J-6s and roughly 106 J-5s, based on the extremely antiquated MiG-17, which took its first flight in January 1950. In a ground attack role, the North's most capable aircraft are 34 copies of the Su-25 Frogfoot, accompanied by 18 copies of the Su-7, an aircraft that first flew in 1955. That said, North Korea is the first nation on our list to possess dedicated bomber aircraft. It flies about 80 Chinese-built variants of the Soviet Ilyushin Il-28. That aircraft was once a mainstay of Soviet Allied air forces, capable of carrying 3,000 kilos, 6,600 pounds of bombs. If that figure sounds a bit low, that's because this aircraft is even more elderly than North Korea's others. It first flew in July of 1948. Elsewhere in its inventory, North Korea flies 20 Mi-24 helicopter gunships. How much of this kit is actually airworthy is up for debate, but the general consensus is that whatever the flyable percentage is, that percentage is almost certainly pretty low. Across their shared border, South Korea suffers from no such problems. Between its intimate defense partnership with the United States and its booming and fast-evolving homegrown aerospace industry, the Republic of Korea Air Force is not to be messed with. Like most US allies, South Korea has long made the F-16 the linchpin of its air defense effort, flying nearly 170 of the jets in either a dedicated combat role or doing double duty as combat aircraft and trainers. Those F-16s are backed up by another highly potent piece of American hardware, the F-15E Strike Eagle, in this case, a specialized Korean version known as the Slam Eagle. Like all Strike Eagles, the Slam Eagle boasts top speeds of Mach 2.5 and purportedly even higher, with an impressive combat range and the capacity to carry over 10,000 kilos or 23,000 pounds of ordnance on either pylons, bomb racks, or a combination of the two. South Korea's specialized versions also feature a unique search and track system, a custom electronic warfare suite, advanced weaponry, and more, all of which are being updated to even more modernized standards. Rounding out the American portion of South Korea's arsenal are 61 older model F-5 Tiger jets, over 300 Cobra MD-500, and Apache attack helicopters, and an anticipated total of nearly 60 F-35 Lightnings, with about a third of that total still on the way. But South Korea also builds its own advanced jets, starting with the Fa-50 Golden Eagle. Between the Golden Eagle and its T-50 trainer variant, South Korea plans to fly over 100 of the craft, which it's quickly turning into a mainstay of other modernizing air forces. We've mentioned the Fa-50 briefly, but it's about time that we mention the specs. A top speed of Mach 1.5, a total of 7 underwing hardpoints, with the capacity to carry 5,400 kilograms or 12,000 pounds of payload, and a range of nearly 2,000 kilometers or 1,150 miles. It's affordable, easy to operate, versatile in its combat role, and an ideal export product for Korea, leading the way toward its successor aircraft. That successor, by the way, is named the KF-21 Boromai, and while it's not quite a 5th-generation aircraft, it's generally referred to as a 4++ generation jet, indicating that it's as close to being a 5th gen as you can get without checking all the boxes at once. Although only a handful of prototypes exist today, South Korea intends to make the Boromai a mainstay of its air force, with 20 early model airframes already on order. Featuring stealth technology in its airframe, plus an internal weapons bay, the Boromai bears a futuristic design when viewing it from the outside. It's also got the ability to push Mach 1.8, carry respectable amounts of ordnance, and mount all manner of advanced weaponry that's either just coming into existence or has yet to exist. South Korea anticipates flying well over 100 of the jets in due time, and is working to offer the Boromai to a range of potential export customers. But even though South Korea is the architect of the Boromai, it's not the only nation on the Boromai project. Instead, it partners with Indonesia, whose air force doesn't quite stand shoulder to shoulder with its ally, but still demands to be taken seriously nonetheless. Indonesia will eventually pick up a few dozen Boromai aircraft, although it doesn't have any orders placed right now, and it flies about a dozen Golden Eagle aircraft in a light attack capacity, eventually planning to own a total of 19. The country's got 33 F-16s, mostly the relatively modern F-16C and D, plus a total of 16 aircraft from Russia's line of 4th-generation Sukhoi aircraft, 5 Su-27s and 11 Su-30s. Indonesia flies both a jet fighter in a ground attack role and a prop plane, 20 copies of the British Hawk 200 for jet-powered close air support, and 13 Super Tucanos primarily for use in Indonesia's rugged areas where long-running insurgencies still thrive. But right now, the big-ticket item in Indonesia's air force is the one that'll soon become the centerpiece of its arsenal, the Rafael. Indonesia has 42 of the jets incoming, although none have yet arrived, and when those 42 are paired with South Korea's Boromai, they'll grant Indonesia some of the best air capability possible without a 5th-gen fighter among the ranks. Alright, so before we leave the South Pacific, we got to touch quickly on Taiwan, where a potent air force is one of the few things standing between the little island and the prospect of conquest by a much larger rival in mainland China. As a key US ally, Taiwan relies upon precisely the American fighter aircraft you might expect. A bit over 100 F-16s in the process of being upgraded to modern standards. Another 56 of the aircraft currently on order. Alongside its F-16, Taiwan flies more than 40 Mirage 2000 aircraft, as well as an aircraft all its own, 103 combat-ready copies of the AIDC FCK-1, colloquially known as the IDF, or Indigenous Defense Fighter. First brought into service in 1992, the IDF jet has never been sold to a foreign customer, instead being kept entirely for Taiwan's own purposes. Built when the US refused to sell Taiwan F-16s and the subsequently cancelled F-20 jet under pressure from China, Taiwan basically created a fighter that could competently fill the role of both aircraft. In addition to its combat arsenal, Taiwan flies 6 airframes of the E-2 Hawkeye, an airborne early warning aircraft that first entered US Navy service in the 1960s. Notably, Taiwan has yet to procure the F-35, although the nation is reportedly putting out feelers in the wake of a 2024 election victory by Donald Trump. And last, before leaving Asia for this section, we circle over to Kazakhstan, one of the most potent post-Soviet air forces outside of Russia. Kazakhstan flies 31 copies of a Soviet fighter that we actually haven't touched on, that also happens to be one of the fastest operational combat aircraft in the world. And that aircraft is the MiG-31, first introduced to service in the early 1980s. Pushed to its absolute limits, the MiG-31 is capable of hitting at least Mach 3.2, nearly 4,000 kilometers an hour or 2,500 miles per hour. That's just a hair short of the listed top speed of the aircraft that the MiG-31 was built to catch, the retired SR-71 Blackbird, although US spy stories tell of a significantly faster true top speed of the Blackbirds that they flew. Known to NATO forces as the Foxhound, the MiG-31 is a dedicated interceptor capable of carrying up to 8 air-to-air missiles, although it can also carry certain air-to-surface weapons. Alongside its MiG-31s, Kazakhstan flies a relatively standard collection of post-Soviet kit. It's got 20 combat-worthy Su-27s plus 43 copies of its successor, the air superiority Su-30. It's got 12 MiG-29s, 12 Su-25s to go along with them. In Kazakhstan's non-combat air wing, it's waiting on the delivery of 2 Airbus A400M aircraft, the Atlas, for its tactical and strategic airlift purposes. The Atlas can carry up to 116 paratroopers or other kit equivalent to 37,000 kilos, nearly 82,000 pounds, while flying at a ferry range of 8,700 kilometers. It's capable of taking off and landing on even shorter runways than American C-17 Globemaster, helped along by its use of 4 propellers rather than 4 jet engines. For ground attack purposes, Kazakhstan flies 32 Mi-24 helicopter gunships, including 12 later model variants designated the Mi-35. From our list of Asian regional powers, we move over to the Middle East, and in the Middle East, we begin with Saudi Arabia. And it's here that we get to introduce 2 fighter jets that we haven't yet discussed, the Eurofighter Typhoon and the Panavia Tornado. Both developed jointly by the UK, Italy, and Germany, the Typhoon and the Tornado are popular aircraft in relatively modernized air forces, with the Tornado first entering service in 1979 and the Typhoon in 2003. Owing to its age, the Tornado is a variable swept-wing fighter built at a time when swing-wing airplanes were all the rage. Saudi Arabia boasts 81 of the aircraft, specifically the Strike Fighter bomber version, which have a proven record as flying trucks to carry a whole lot of heavy weapons. As for the Typhoon, Saudi Arabia flies 81 of those aircraft. A slick, delta-winged air superiority fighter, the Typhoon is on the upper end of the 4th generation of fighter jets, pushing top speeds of Mach 2.5, boasting a combat range of nearly 1,400 kilometers or over 850 miles for ground attack, and carrying over 9,000 kilograms or almost 20,000 pounds of ordnance across a total of 13 hardpoints. But although 152 Typhoons and Tornadoes put together would be enough to secure the airspace of most nations without much trouble, they aren't even the most prevalent fighter jet in Saudi Arabia's arsenal. That honor goes instead to the F-15E Strike Eagle, of which 210 combat-optimized airframes currently fly in Saudi service alongside a handful of trainers. The country is in the process of upgrading all of its Strike Eagles to a specialized standard known as Saudi Advanced, the first member of an Advanced Eagle family of aircraft that now includes a specialized Qatari version, a specialized Israeli version, and the F-15EX Eagle II, an absolute beast of an airplane that we'll be talking about later on. In addition to its fighter and strike jets, Saudi Arabia operates not 1, but 2 types of airborne early warning and control aircraft, 6 copies of the Boeing E-3 Sentry and 2 copies of the Saab 2000, outfitted with the Era-I radar system. The Saudis fly a grand total of 22 tanker aircraft, including 9 copies of the KC-130 Hercules and the upgraded Super Hercules, along with older KC-707s and the European-made MRTT, based off the Airbus A330. Its army flies 47 American Apache helicopters and over 40 older model OH-58s. Additionally, Saudi Arabia invests heavily in its drone technologies and is working to develop its own large-scale production capabilities in that realm. From Saudi Arabia, let's cross the Persian Gulf to explore its longtime rival, the nation of Iran. On the spectrum of globally embargoed air forces, Iran isn't quite as much a museum as North Korea or Cuba, but it's still a place where parts shortages and unclear numbers of flyable aircraft have to be taken into account. Iran is one of 2 nations ever to fly the F-14 Tomcat, an aircraft that it received in large numbers from the plane's developer, the United States, prior to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Capable of flying above Mach 2.3, the swing-wing F-14 was a beloved aircraft in its day from the perspective of its American operators, although it was retired from US service in 2006. Today, Iran has about 40 of the aircraft, although it's not clear how many of those planes, if any at all, are still flyable. Alongside its F-14s, Iran possesses about 30 MiG-29 fighters, which Russia claims to have upgraded. It possesses 35 copies of the American-made F-5, over 60 American-made F-4s, and a dozen French-made Mirage F-1s, although all of those aircraft are subject to the same embargo regime enforced by the UN through 2020. It also flies small numbers of 3 indigenously produced jets based on the F-5 design, the Sakar, the Korsar, and the Azarkash, with about 20 of those jets in total. The country flies over 20 swing-wing Su-24 attack jets, about 17 Chinese-built copies of the MiG-21, 7 aerial refuelers, and 28 American tactical airlifters subject to embargo until 2020, and 5 copies of the Soviet-era strategic airlifter, the IL-76. Notably, Iran is on the hook for an order of 24 Russian-made Su-35s, the dedicated air superiority successor to the Su-27. But per recent reporting, Iran's struggles in preparing to accept that order have been so great that they may be making Russia disinterested in selling Iran other aircraft. But Iran isn't Saudi Arabia's only rival in the Middle East. Instead, we've got to check in with Iran's longtime frenemy in the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates. The core of the Emirati Air Force is the same piece of hardware we've mentioned so many times already, the American-made F-16. The UAE flies 55 recently produced copies of the jet, spearheading a force that also includes 44 combat-ready Mirage 2000s coming out of France. But for the UAE, ground attack comes in the form of low and slow propeller planes rather than high-powered Strike Eagles, and although the UAE flies 2 close air support prop planes, it doesn't field the Super Tucano. Instead, the Emirates fly 18 airframes of the AT-82I, an up-armored and exceptionally lethal version of a crop duster that the US military developed into the related OA-1K Skywarden. The Emirates also expect to soon receive 24 copies of the Calidus B-250, an indigenously produced Emirati prop plane that can fly fast, long, and far while carrying nearly 2 metric tons of ordnance across 7 hardpoints. Elsewhere in its air fleet, the UAE flies 30 Apache attack helicopters, eventually planning to fly a total of 40, plus 8 C-17 strategic airlifters and an anticipated 5 MRTT tankers. Finally, in the UAE, the question of Air Force modernization has become a more contentious subject than it's been for nearly any other nation on Earth. Despite its long-term efforts to procure the aircraft, the UAE does not have and does not intend to procure American F-35s, according to recent reporting. That's an announcement that sent sighs of relief rippling through the defense world after long-running concerns that if the UAE got the F-35, Saudi Arabia would demand the F-35, and then Iran would get Russian or Chinese fifth-generation fighters, and an arms race would risk spiraling upward from there. Instead, after its F-35 deal was unceremoniously suspended back in 2021, the UAE now intends to import a full 80 Rafale aircraft from France. When those aircraft will arrive from the Rafale's notoriously slow production lines is anyone's guess, but once it does, it should fit the Emirates' needs just fine. And then we turn to Turkey, where the tried and true methodology of spamming F-16s is taken to a new level. Turkey flies roughly 202 combat-ready F-16s, almost all of them built under license within Turkey, and most of them in the process of being upgraded to the modern F-16V standard. Turkey also flies 19 copies of the American-made Vietnam-era F-4 Phantom, although Turkey's come with both a twist and a badass name. Turkey's F-4Es are known as the Terminator 2020 model, outfitted with vastly improved avionics of all sorts and made capable of launching all manner of nasty modern weaponry. Turkey flies 4 copies of that Australian early warning and control aircraft that we mentioned earlier, the E-7 Wedgetail, although it's called the Peace Eagle in Turkey, which is nice. The country flies 7 KZ-135 Stratotankers, several types of electronic warfare plane, and will eventually field 16 Atlas strategic airlifters. It also flies 54 indigenously produced attack helicopters, conveniently dubbed the ATAC, plus a handful of American choppers in both its Army Aviation Wing and its Navy. Eventually, Turkey hopes to procure American-made F-35s, but in the meantime, it's got its own 5th-generation fighter on the way, the Khan, planned for introduction to service in the 2030s. It's at about this time that both Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America drop off our list, but there's 2 Latin American nations that at least bear some discussion: Colombia and Mexico. The strength of an air force is, in many ways, relative, and compared to their neighbors, these 2 countries do fly more kit than most. Colombia flies 17 combat-ready versions of the Kfir, an Israeli fighter aircraft based on the French Mirage 5. It also flies 23 A-29 Super Tucanos and 12 of the low-powered American attack jets, the A-37 Dragonfly. Both have proved instrumental in Colombia's counterinsurgency efforts, and so has a particularly unique attack aircraft, the Basler BT-67. Based on the DC-3, which in turn got its introduction to commercial service all the way back in 1936, the BT-67 is both heavily modernized and upgraded into a gunship. As of late 2024, Colombia has agreed to upgrade its air fleet with a pack of Swedish Gripen aircraft. Mexico, by contrast, has no such plans. The country flies 63 Swiss Pilatus PC-7 aircraft, although nearly half are used for training. Light, relatively slow, and equipped exclusively for close air support, the Pilatus is a tool befitting a nation with cartels running amok on its soil, zero threatening nearby air forces from its Latin American neighbors, and a military superpower so powerful next door in the form of the United States means that just buying proper fighter aircraft isn't worth it. And rounding out the regional powers, let's return to Europe, where we'll be discussing exclusively NATO air forces from here on out. We begin with Poland, a nation currently leading the way in the push towards remilitarization across the continent. Prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Poland's air force was, if not feeble, then certainly underdeveloped. It consisted of just 13 flight-ready MiG-29s, 12 flight-ready but antiquated Su-22 fighter bombers, and 36 flight-ready F-16s that had fallen behind the aircraft standards for modernization. Now, though, it is a very different story. Poland is waiting on the transfer of a total of 36 F-35 stealth fighters, along with 48 South Korean F-A-50 Golden Eagles. It's committed to upgrading its entire F-16 fleet to the F-16V standard, and it's considering buying F-15EX aircraft, though the number it might want is uncertain. The country has picked up 2 Saab 340 early warning aircraft fitted with the Swedish Iri system, and it's been courted for purchase of either more F-16s or a set of Eurofighter Typhoons. It's got 96 Apache attack helicopters on order, slated to arrive by 2032, and it's investing in the rapid acquisition of Turkish Bayraktar drones capable of precision airstrikes. And Poland could find a friend in the Italian Air Force, where a grand total of 95 F-35s are on order. When they arrive, those aircraft will replace Italy's 41 combat-ready Tornado aircraft, including 28 strike versions and 13 electronic warfare versions. They'll join 93 Eurofighter Typhoons, of which 27 are expected to be switched out and replaced with new models, bringing Italy's projected future air force to nearly 200 multi-role aircraft. The country is waiting on the arrival of 3 modified business jets that will carry airborne early warning systems, and they'll operate 7 American-made refueling tankers and 5 Predator drones, plus 59 Italian-made Mangusta anti-armor helicopters in Army aviation. The Italian Navy will eventually operate an additional 20 F-35s off its 2 light aircraft carriers, joining 14 vertical takeoff and landing capable Harrier jump jets. Across a small stretch of sea, Greece fields one of the more eclectic but capable air forces in all of NATO, and it's one of the only global air forces to fly the F-35 Lightning and the French Rafale side by side. Greece flies 20 Rafales with the eventual goal of acquiring 4 more, and while it doesn't have any F-35s in its arsenal yet, it's let Lockheed Martin know that it's good for 20 of the aircraft. When they arrive, they'll join Lockheed Martin's ubiquitous fighter, the F-16, of which 114 airframes are intended for combat service within the Greek Hellenic Air Force. Greece also flies 24 Mirage 2000 aircraft, although it recently surrendered 18 more in exchange for its new Rafales. And, like Turkey, Greece flies heavily modified, relatively modernized copies of the F-4 Phantom, 33 of them in total. The country flies 4 Iri early warning aircraft via the Brazilian R-99 jet, while its 1st Army Aviation Brigade flies the Apache attack helicopter. And on the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish Air Force and Space Force boasts some impressive hardware of its own. Like Canada and Australia, Spain has made the FA-18 Hornet the central component of its air force, flying 70 for the purposes of air defense and another 12 primarily as trainers. As a contributor nation to the Eurofighter Typhoon project, it's also got some Typhoons of its own, naturally. That includes 19 copies of the latest Typhoon version and a cumulative 49 Typhoons that came in a prior edition. The nation has 45 even newer Typhoons on the way, and while it's not yet committed to the purchase of any F-35s, it may not have to. Spain is one of 3 nations, alongside France and Germany, working on something called the Future Combat Air System, an effort to field not a 5th, but a 6th generation fighter by the year 2040. Details on the aircraft are not yet available. Spain also flies 17 A400M Atlas strategic airlifters out of a total of 27 on order, and it's waiting on several refueling tankers as well. The Spanish Army Aviation Wing, or more properly the Spanish Army Air Mobile Force, flies 24 Eurocopter Tiger helicopters, while the Spanish Navy leverages its single aircraft carrier to fly 11 Harrier jump jets, of which 10 are intended to serve in a combat role. And finally, we'll touch on the 2 most recent entries to the NATO alliance, Finland and Sweden. Between the 2 of them, it's Finland that flies the more standard NATO kit, including 54 combat-ready copies of the FA-18. Those aircraft are just now starting to be retired, with the imminent arrival of 64 F-35s to replace them. The F-35 is more than capable of operating in the Finnish High North, where it'll patrol NATO's longest single-nation stretch of border with Russia. That's basically the extent of what Finland's packing. Advanced, highly capable, but pretty one-dimensional if you call an air force of multi-role fighters one-dimensional. Sweden, however, it's a different story. The proud owner of an aerospace industrial complex all its own, Sweden flies nearly 100 airframes of its own, indigenously designed JAS-39 Gripen, with the eventual goal of having 120 modern airframes in service. We haven't yet spoken about the Gripen's capabilities, so we'll do it here. First introduced to service in 1996, the Delta Wing multi-role Gripen is advanced, highly maneuverable, NATO interoperable, and reportedly a pleasure to fly. It can hit top speeds of Mach 2, 2,100 kilometers or 1,300 miles per hour, with a combat range of 800 kilometers or 500 miles and 8 hardpoints to carry a respectable amount of hardware. It's capable of takeoff on runways as short as 400 meters or 1,300 feet and landing on runways of 500 meters or 1,600 feet, ideal for a nation that expects its aircraft to take off and land from civilian freeways. The most modern version of the Gripen includes even more hardpoints, technological and payload improvements across the board, and more. It should be no surprise that Sweden also flies several aircraft with its own ERI early warning system, and although it has no plans to procure the F-35, it's believed to have gotten involved with another 6th-generation fighter program, the GCAP, or Global Combat Air Program, with the UK, Japan, and Italy. Okay, now it's time to start talking about the big dogs of military aviation, the world-class air forces that could stand on their own 2 feet. We start with one particular air force that straddles the gap between this category and that of a more regional power, and that's Japan. At a glance, Japan's air fleet doesn't go too far beyond the nations we've just wrapped up discussing. It flies about a total of 36 F-35s, plus about 200 gradually upgraded F-15 Eagles produced in-house in Japan. Along with those superiority fighters, Japan flies the multi-role F-2, an indigenously produced aircraft based on the F-16. It's got 86 F-2s in service, 62 of them intended to serve as fighter aircraft. It's a sizable air force, to be sure, but when it's placed beside, say, Saudi Arabia, it's difficult to draw a distinction. The difference makers here are twofold, and one has more to do with alliances than anything else. While a number of nations around the world are allied with the United States, Japan is the temporary home for very high numbers of US aircraft, meaning that American air power simply must be factored in when discussing Japanese air defense. And beyond its key ally, Japan's non-combat aircraft make a big difference. The country is expected to fly a total of 30 E-2 early warning and control aircraft, plus another 4 modified Boeing 767s for the same purpose. It's slated to have a total of 12 aerial refueling tankers within the next few years, and it's a member of the Global Combat Air Program initiative that we just mentioned. Its Izumo-class warships are expected to fly a total of 42 additional F-35s over the next few years. All told, Japan simply has a better and more well-rounded capacity to wage an effective air war, and it's invested in the tools and specific aircraft to make its air force more than the sum of its combat jets. The other major power in Asia that doesn't quite get into superpower territory, although it's close, is India. The Indian Air Force features a highly developed and robust arsenal, and one that's constantly going through upgrades to bring it towards a global top-tier standard. The centerpiece of its Air Force is a Russian jet, the Su-30, but specifically the Su-30 MKI. Built in country by Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, India has about 260 MKIs in its arsenal at the time of writing and continues to add to the overall count. Those aircraft have been continually upgraded over time and adapted to carry both international and indigenously produced missiles and other weapons. At the time of writing, the MKI fleet is upgrading to a new standard under India's Super Sokhoi program, with the intent to alter a total of 51 systems inside the jet using hardware of primarily Indian design and manufacture. The aircraft are getting new radar, better engines, an enhanced avionics and electronic warfare suite, and the capacity to carry a set of new missiles with possible integration of artificial intelligence into some subsystems. Alongside its Su-30 fleet, the Indian Air Force relies on 52 flight-ready MiG-29s and 36 French Rafales to form its air superiority vanguard, although in the years to come it'll also pick up a new addition. That addition would be the Tejas, India's first indigenously developed modern combat aircraft. A delta-wing jet with a bulky profile, the Tejas can fly at Mach 1.8 with a combat range comparable to its peers, carrying all manner of India-produced and international munitions across 9 hardpoints. Although the Indian Air Force has just a handful of trainer versions in its possession today, it intends to produce at least 324 of the aircraft in the coming decades. Nearly 200 aircraft have been approved to integrate into the Indian Air Force once they're complete. Rounding out the IAF's combat wing are 37 French Mirage 2000 jets plus 115 Jaguar attack aircraft, a jointly developed English and French supersonic design that first saw service in the 1970s. Quick and precise in an attack role, the Jaguar offers a very different solution for close air support than the low and slow aircraft that one might expect, but it is highly capable nonetheless. Finally, India is phasing out the last of its MiG-21s, an aircraft that certainly doesn't seem vital when weighed against the rest of India's kit. Aside from the jet fighters of its air force, India's armed forces feature a range of other combat aircraft. Within its air force, the nation relies on no fewer than 4 types of attack helicopter, 22 copies of the American Apache, 15 later model copies of the Soviet Mi-24, and eventually well over 100 indigenously produced choppers too. That includes a projected 76 Pratt helicopters, broadly similar in shape and role to the Apache, and 66 copies of the Rudra, a weaponized version of an Indian-made utility helicopter called the Dhruv. India's Army Aviation Wing flies 75 more of the Rudra and intends to fly a total of 95 more Pratchens, plus 17 Apache helicopters that have yet to arrive. India is investing heavily into unmanned combat drones, armed drone swarms, and kamikaze drones, while the Indian Navy currently flies 33 combat-capable MiG-29s and even more drones off its 2 aircraft carriers. Yet as impressive as India's air arsenal already is, it's also got a number of significant non-combat aircraft at its disposal. India flies 3 Soviet-era Beriev A-50s, massive aircraft with a hulking radome to provide early warning and control capabilities. India intends to fly 5 Berievs eventually, along with 3 Brazilian Embraer R-99s, mounting an Indian-developed early warning and control system. The nation flies 6 Soviet-era tankers, 11 C-17 strategic airlifters, 17 IL-76 strategic airlifters, well over 200 smaller tactical airlifters, and more. Yet just as important as where the Indian Air Force is now is the question of where it's going. India plans to fly a fully indigenous air force by the year 2042, and it's planning to procure a second line of fighter, the Medium Multi-Role Combat Aircraft, or MMRCA-2, for which a contest is still ongoing. 114 of the aircraft will eventually go into Indian service. The country plans to fly 12 early warning and control aircraft, mounting its own hardware, and intends to procure up to 80 indigenously designed transport aircraft. It's got an ongoing effort to develop a twin-engine 5th-generation combat aircraft known as the AMCA, plus a so-called omni-role aircraft to fulfill a role similar to the Rafale. Finally, Hindustan Aeronautics is working on an armed stealth drone called the Cat's Warrior, intended to fly beside manned combat aircraft as a loyal wingman. From Asia, we travel to North Africa, where although Egypt doesn't quite rival the military ambition of India, it boasts more and better aircraft than anybody else on the African continent. Egypt's Air Force revolves, like so many others, around the F-16, with a full 218 airframes filling the bulk of its combat air arsenal. Those Vipers have been upgraded over time, although they aren't at the F-16V modern standard. Out on the bleeding edge, ahead of its F-16s, Egypt was the first nation to become an export customer for the Rafale, with a couple of dozen of the aircraft currently in its arsenal now, and a projected 56 to fill out its air force in due time. The nation also flies 31 MiG-29s, 17 Mirage 2000s, and a small handful of Alpha jets in combat roles, providing light attack, air patrol, and other more rudimentary services. Supporting its fighters, Egypt flies 7 Hawkeye early warning and control planes, a range of auxiliary aircraft, and a wide range of unmanned attack and surveillance drones. Egypt has at its disposal a very robust set of attack helicopters, including 45 Apaches, 13 Mi-24 gunships, 46 Russia Ka-50 Black Sharks, and 70 French Gazelle Scouts and anti-armor choppers. Much like India, modernization and continual improvement is the top priority of the Egyptian Air Force, as it works to both attain and prove its parity with highly esteemed air forces around the world. Unlike India, however, Egypt has had trouble settling on a new aircraft after trouble procuring Russian-made MiG-35s, American-made F-35s, and even some of the weapons needed to arm its F-16s. Egypt is known to have dug into the prospect of acquiring F-15E Strike Eagles as well as Eurofighter Typhoons, and now it's not unlikely that Israel could become a customer for the F-15EX. But in the late summer of 2024, Egypt threw the US and Europe a bit of a curveball, announcing that it would move to replace its F-16 fleet with the Chinese J-10 aircraft, and specifically the J-10C. Featuring a stealthier design, a better radar and avionics suite, a more powerful engine, and new Chinese-made air-to-air missiles, the J-10C has been described in some circles as a 4.5 generation fighter, similar to the French Rafale or the Korean Boromai. By going to the J-10, Egypt can throw off a set of restrictions that have long plagued its air force, specifically Western limitations on the arms it can receive. For years, Egypt has added Russian and French kit to its arsenal, specifically because of difficult experiences dealing with America around its F-16s, and it's been hobbled with technologically inferior weaponry for about a decade now. China's alternative is far cheaper, with sophisticated weaponry and with none of the headaches that have come from its dealings with Washington. Across a shared border with Egypt lies another aviation powerhouse with far fewer qualms about relying on the Americans for its arsenal. Israel has long counted itself among America's closest allies, and even now, waging war on multiple fronts, it has yet to find the limits of American support. Although it may not boast the same numbers as America or China, Israel's air force is, pound for pound, among the very best in the world. To explain its combat prowess, we begin with the Adir, a specially modified, Israel-exclusive version of the F-35. The Adir integrates a range of Israeli avionics and electronic warfare systems, plus Israeli-designed air-to-air missiles and guided bombs. These modifications are due, in part, to Israel's assessment that the F-35's stealth may be compromised by new and emerging technologies, necessitating later changes that Israel would like to dictate on its own stock. Israel will eventually field 75 Adir jets with about 40 in its arsenal today. Following the Adir into combat are 175 F-16s, including the F-16I Sufa, another Israeli-modified design of which Israel has procured over 100. Again, the aircraft features enhanced avionics, including a cockpit and a series of displays that are all Israel's own. It's compatible with French and Israeli missiles and fuel tanks. Finally, Israel flies 66 F-15 Eagles and Strike Eagles, predominantly yet another Israel-modified design, the F-15I. Like the other aircraft in Israel's arsenal, the changes are mostly to do with avionics and weapons compatibility. Israel has ordered a full complement of 50 new F-15EX fighters, and believe it or not, the EX will come in a special variation too, the F-15IA or Israel Advanced. Once the F-15IA makes it into Israel's arsenal along with its remaining Adirs, the country will fly well over 350 advanced combat aircraft that go far beyond the capabilities of any other air force in the Middle East. Of course, that's not the full extent of Israel's aerial capabilities either. The nation flies 4 airborne early warning and control aircraft, 14 aerial refueling tankers with 8 more on the way, and 48 Apache attack helicopters, among others. It's also a highly prolific user of unmanned drones, carrying out precision airstrikes frequently and employing an arsenal of unknown size. Moving on to the Americas, we've just got one solitary entry in this section, the nation of Brazil coming in second only to the United States in terms of air power on the American supercontinent. Much like Sweden, South Korea or India, Brazil leverages a robust homegrown aviation industry, and it's willing, even eager, to work across borders and across entire oceans to step into a new age. The nation is in the midst of an air power renaissance, committing in 2023 to double the size of its air force and substantively round out its capabilities. At present, not all the benefits of that modernization have shown themselves. The linchpin of Brazil's air force is still a significantly upgraded version of the American-made F-5. Those F-5s will be phased out by the end of the decade, and its 24 copies of its homegrown attack jet, the AMX International, will be out of service even sooner, by the end of 2025. The AMX, by the way, was produced jointly with Italy, where credit is due. But Brazil has also chosen to work closely with Sweden in the latest edition upgrade to the Gripen aircraft, the JAS 39E and 39F. The aircraft are being manufactured at home in Brazil with a single-seat version enhanced to stand alongside the more advanced aircraft of the 4th generation and the twin-seater version, offering the capability to house a backseat battle manager with a variety of information warfare tools at their disposal. Not only that, but Brazil flies 68 of its simple-looking but world-renowned counterinsurgency and close air support aircraft, the A-29 Super Tucano. Its airborne early warning systems come by way of its homegrown R-99 aircraft mounted with the Swedish Iriai system, while for its strategic airlift needs, it'll eventually operate 19 of Brazil's own C-390 aircraft, the Millennium. Capable of hauling 26 metric tons or 57,000 pounds of cargo, the Millennium can fly at high speed, operate at a ferry range of over 6,000 kilometers or nearly 4,000 miles, and leverage hardpoints to add extra fuel tanks or other capabilities. Its Navy flies a small handful of A-4 Skyhawks off its aircraft carrier and intends to select a new attack aircraft to replace them. And from the Americas, we circle to Europe, where 2 NATO air forces stand out above all the rest, France and the United Kingdom. starting off with France, it should be no surprise which aircraft sits at the heart of its arsenal, and that is the Rafale, of which France intends to eventually fly 185 airframes in its Air Force alone. The nation will eventually fly an additional 53 copies of the naval version of the Rafale, of which over 40 are already in service. Those 240-odd aircraft won't be the extent of France's Rafale acquisitions either. The nation recently inked a contract to pick up an additional 42 Rafales, these ones drawn from its so-called Tranche 5. These aircraft are intended to be about as advanced as a fighter jet can possibly get without crossing into the stealth requirements of the F-35 or the J-20. Making up any gaps in the French Air Force, at least for a little while longer, are upgraded versions of the multi-role Mirage 2000, of which about 90 airframes remain in service. Elsewhere in its arsenal, France flies 4 Boeing E-3s and will eventually fly 6 naval E-2 Hawkeyes for early warning and control purposes, plus 15 Airbus MRTT tankers, 2 KC-130Js and 5 KC-135 Stratotankers. It plans to field a full 50 copies of the A400M Atlas for strategic airlift, while the air wing of its army flies just short of 70 Eurocopter Tiger attack helicopters. For both economic reasons surrounding a desire to represent its export product well and pragmatic reasons around the actual needs of its air force, France appears disinterested in acquiring the F-35 anytime soon. But it's already working on a loyal wingman drone to fly alongside the Rafale, and it's working alongside Germany and Spain to procure its future combat air system, including, but not limited to, an eventual 6th-generation fighter. In the UK, it's another all-European fighter that makes up the bulk of its air force, the Eurofighter Typhoon. Introduced to the UK's Air Force in 2003, just over 100 of the jets still fly today, although the oldest among them are already due to retire by the end of 2025. Owing to both the need for newer aircraft and the UK's long-standing defensive alliance with the US, the nation is in the process of adopting the F-35 to its ranks, with a maximum of 138 to be procured over the next few years. The UK intends to acquire 3 Wedgetail early warning and control planes, possibly bumping its order upward in the years to come, and it flies 9 Airbus tankers, 20-plus A400M Atlas airlifters, and 8 C-17 Globemasters. Its Army Air Corps will eventually fly over 90 Apache attack helicopters, while its Naval Fleet Air Arm is in the process of adopting carrier versions of the F-35, although its total number of intended acquisitions is not yet known. Unfortunately for the UK, both its budget and the number of available qualified pilots are likely to be constraining factors in any future growth. And although the nation is part of the 6th-generation Global Combat Air Programme, Britain will have to do substantial work to ensure that it has the personnel and infrastructure to support that aircraft when it enters service, expected in the mid-2030s. At last, we come to our final chapter, where we move past even the major powers and step into the realm of the superpowers. There are 3 nations that we're here to discuss, and we'd hazard a guess that none of them are surprising. The Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, and the United States of America. We'll begin with Russia, where we must issue what has become a well-worn caveat one final time. Russia is a nation involved in a large-scale active military conflict, and as a result, it's lost aircraft over the last few years. As such, we'll be doing our best to reflect Russia's air arsenal, but there will almost certainly be some discrepancy between the numbers we name and Russia's actual inventory at this time. Although Moscow would certainly like to advertise its newest toy, the Su-57 Felon, as the king of the skies across Eurasia, it's an older Sukhoi model that actually serves as the linchpin of Russia's air arsenal, the Su-27. We'll get to the Su-57 in a bit, but it is the Su-27 and its long line of derivative aircraft that Russia really couldn't bear to go without. The Su-27 flanker itself is slowly being phased out of Russian service, although a portion of Russia's flankers have been at least partially modernized, but there are thought to be about 100 of the jets still serving faithfully. Taking up their banner as the older models phase out are the multi-role Su-30 with at least 110 in service, the heavy fighter bomber Su-34 with at least 160 in service, and the more improved, solidly 21st century Su-35 multi-role fighter with at least 115 in service. Together, the Su-27-derived portion of Russia's air force is capable of standing up to nearly any foreign threat that Russia can think of, with the forces of NATO and the Chinese Air Force accepted. Nor are the Su-27 derivatives alone in frontline service. Joining them are somewhere between 100 and 200 copies of the MiG-29, along with somewhere between 130 and 250 copies of the dedicated high supersonic interceptor, the MiG-31. Russia is also in the process of procuring as many copies as it can of a more modernized successor to the MiG-29, dubbed the MiG-35. Marketed and described within Russia as a 4++ generation fighter, meaning that it is at the very furthest cutting edge of non-stealth fighters alongside the Rafale, the F-15EX, and a few others, the MiG-35 is actually the subject of some debate. Detractors suggest that it's only gotten a new name for marketing purposes and it isn't really all that it's cracked up to be. Regardless though, the MiG-35 features hugely improved avionics relative to the MiG-29, including advanced radar systems, and after a very sluggish start to production, Russia is finally believed to have started rolling them off the production lines in decent numbers. Russia is only known to fly 6 of the aircraft at the time of writing, but it's believed to have many more on the way. Rounding out its list of fighter aircraft, Russia flies the Su-57 Felon with somewhere around 25 airframes thought to be flying at the time of writing. The Felon, much like the MiG-35, is the subject of considerable debate in the military aerospace world, although the debate over the Felon is louder and more polarized than debate over the MiG-35 ever was. According to Moscow, the Su-57 is a 5th-generation fighter, and since we'll be talking about several 5th-generation fighters in this final section, let's discuss what that term is generally understood to mean. Leaving aside the more basic reality that 5th generation, like all discussion of fighter jet generations, is actually an arbitrary designation with no agreed upon meaning, 5th gen fighters usually are understood to include the following: full stealth technology, radar that can avoid detection, highly maneuverable airframes, advanced computers and avionics, data fusion technology, and the ability to fly in supercruise, sustaining supersonic flight for a long period of time. Now, according to Russia, the Su-57's got all of that, and it's got it in spades. The trouble with that claim is that just about the entire non-Russian aligned defense world disputes it. From data suggesting that the Felon's radar return is at least an order of magnitude bigger than the American 5th generation fighters, to photo and video documentation showing exceptionally shoddy workmanship that would almost certainly ruin its stealth features. Therefore, it's not exactly clear whether the Felon is any stealthier than America's Super Hornet or South Korea's early-stage Boromai. It's also been kept far away from the battlefields of Ukraine most of the time, leading to ever-increasing speculation that Russia might not trust the thing near its own front lines. Whether that's to prevent Ukraine from studying the Felon and relaying information to NATO, or because Russia fears the worst-case scenario, getting their new toy shot down in enemy territory, is anybody's guess. Whatever the truth may be, Russia currently flies over 25 Felons and intends to procure 76 over the course of its first production run. After the stealth fighters, we can get into the other hallmark of our big 3 superpowered air forces: dedicated heavy bombers. Russia operates 3 types of heavy bomber, all designed and produced by the vaunted Tupolev Design Bureau, or corporation, in the post-Soviet years. Those include the Tu-22M, the Tu-95, and the Tu-160. The Tu-95 is the oldest of the 3, first introduced to service back in 1956. A 4-engine turboprop plane, the Tu-95 relies on contra-rotating propellers and 15,000 kilograms worth of payload capacity. It's about 33,000 pounds to fill a similar role in Russia as the B-52 does in America, but more on that later. Slow, lumbering, but capable of 2-way flights at a range of up to 15,000 kilometers or 9,300 miles without refueling, the Tu-95 can carry all manner of conventional or nuclear warheads. Russia still flies 47 of the aircraft today. Introduced in 1973, the Tu-22M is considered more advanced. A supersonic aircraft, the Tu-22M features a variable sweep wing in keeping with the swing wing vogue in the era that it was designed. The Tu-22M can hit top speeds of Mach 1.88, it's about 2,000 kilometers or 1,240 miles per hour, although it features a considerably less impressive combat range at 2,500 kilometers or 1,600 miles. It's capable of carrying up to 24,000 kilograms or 53,000 pounds of payload, including not just the regular missiles and bombs, but up to 4 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, Russia's exploding pride and joy over the last decade or so. And to those among our viewers who are in the know about the Kinzhal, yes, we know that the term hypersonic is a bit of a stretch here. We'll discuss that another day if you're interested. Returning to the Tu-22M, Russia flies 58 of the Thundering bombers after 2 are known to have been destroyed in Ukraine. Rounding out the Russian bomber fleet is the Tu-160, first introduced in 1987 and still very much in active production today. The Tu-160 is far and away the best bomber in Russia's arsenal, and although the nation only flies about 15 today, it intends to fly well over 50 when all is said and done. The Tu-160, known in Russia as the White Swan, is a variable swept-wing aircraft capable of hitting Mach 2.05, that's 2,220 kilometers or 1,380 miles per hour. It could cruise at transonic speeds, it can fly for 12,300 kilometers, 7,600 miles without refueling, and while flying at cruising speeds, it can hold 45,000 kilograms or almost 100,000 pounds of ordnance. Among other things, it can carry up to 12 short-range nuclear missiles. So that's nice. Of course, it takes more than just fighters and bombers to build an air force, and Russia's got all the other bells and whistles too. For its dedicated attack aircraft, Russia leverages around 270 Su-24s and nearly 200 Su-25s, although both have lost substantial numbers over Ukraine since 2022. In addition to a range of shorter-range transport aircraft, Russia flies 120 Il-76 strategic airlifters and 4 copies of the absolutely massive Antonov An-124, capable of carrying 150,000 kilograms or 330,000 pounds for ferry flights of 14,000 kilometers or 8,700 miles. It possesses 14 A-50 Beriev command-and-control aircraft, although it's believed to have as few as just 1 or 2 sets of crew available to operate them. Russia flies 20 tanker aircraft, planning to carry 30 when it receives its order from Ilyushin, and it flies 3 Il-80 command-and-control aircraft ready to serve Russia's leaders in the event of all-out nuclear war. The Russian Air Force flies roughly 140 Ka-52 attack helicopters and about 330 Mi-24 heavy gunships, eventually hoping to fly roughly 220 copies of its Mi-28 attack helicopters as well. Nor does the full extent of Russia's air power end there. The country's navy flies 53 Su-27s, somewhere around 60 or 70 Su-30s, roughly 40 to 50 Su-33s, anywhere from 30 to 100 MiG-31 interceptors, and somewhere between 20 and 50 carrier-capable MiG-29s, along with 36 Su-24 attack jets and fewer than 10 Su-25s. Russia's ground forces fly a wide variety of attack and reconnaissance drones, as well as untold numbers of swarm-capable kamikaze drones. The country claims to be actively working on the Beriev A-100 to replace the A-50 early warning and control aircraft, a specialized gunship similar to America's Ghost Rider aircraft, a next-generation transport aircraft called the Pak-VTA, multiple highly advanced fifth-generation fighters including the MiG-41 and the Su-75, and the Tupolev Pak-DA, a purported next-generation stealth strategic bomber. Now, we say that Russia claims to be working on these aircraft because the country's got a way of churning out highly ambitious projects that never materialize, but we certainly don't want to rule out the idea that some may eventually be built. From Russia, we move eastward across Eurasia until we reach the nation of China. Now, just on the raw numbers alone, the People's Liberation Army Air Force is exceptionally impressive, fielding well over 2,200 combat aircraft, even before factoring in support aircraft. We can check some of those off the list relatively early, as they are either derived directly from Russian aircraft or they simply are Russian aircraft. That includes 32 Su-27s, nearly 100 Su-30s, 24 Su-35s, 245 license-built Shenyang J-11s deriving from the Su-27 model, and roughly 330 combined J-7 and J-8 aircraft, both license-built variants of the MiG-21 and both in the process of being phased out. All in all, well over 700 of China's combat aircraft are Russian or Russian-derived. But the rest? That's all China. The most common indigenously produced fighter in China's arsenal, by far, is the J-10, that same F-16 analog that we've discussed in detail when covering prior air forces. Subtracting the aircraft used as trainers, China flies about 500 of the multi-role J-10s, including roughly 220 copies of the substantially upgraded J-10C, which is believed to be on par with the upper crust of fourth-generation fighter jets worldwide. Rounding out China's homegrown fourth-generation arsenal is the Shenyang J-16, also known as the Hidden Dragon. Although it's a successor to the Su-27 derivative, the J-11, the J-16 is very much a Chinese aircraft, and perhaps indicating the extent of its value to its home nation, China does not offer the J-16 up for sale. It's believed to have somewhere between 280 and 400 J-16s at the time of writing, with those numbers ever expanding as time goes on. Capable of flight at Mach 2, the J-16 mounts munitions on 12 external hardpoints and features advanced radar and electronic warfare capabilities alongside other key technological attributes that allow it to join the J-10C in the upper echelon of non-stealth fighters. Notably, China doesn't fly any copies of one fighter that it helped to design, the JF-17 Thunder, preferring to leave that aircraft as an export product. Most important of all is the Chengdu J-20, the Mighty Dragon. Although some elements of its design, including its potentially unstealthy canards, have led to some speculation that the Mighty Dragon's stealth profile is overstated, it hasn't drawn nearly as much skepticism as the Su-57, and at a bare minimum, it's thought to be a highly advanced aircraft, no matter what generation it belongs to. Exact procurement numbers on the jet are unknown, especially because China does not offer it for export, but the nation is thought to have built at least 300 of the jets at the time of writing, and production doesn't appear to be slowing down anytime soon. The J-20 is capable of flight at Mach 2 with a very impressive combat range of 2,000 kilometers or 1,200 miles, and it features internal weapons bays that allow it to carry substantial concealed munitions, while with the addition of unstealthy weapons on its external hardpoints, the J-20 can carry up to 11,000 kilograms or 24,000 pounds of weapons. It features highly advanced radar, an electro-optical targeting system, and a fully digital cockpit, although China's secretive approach to the aircraft would suggest that other capabilities may not have been made public. Many defense experts suggest that the J-20's specific stealth shaping eliminates concerns about its canards, while the entire body of the aircraft is built to almost completely erase its radar signature. Not only that, but China continues to upgrade the jet over time, building an improved version in the last couple of years that features a major software and avionics overhaul and across-the-board stealth improvements. China also just revealed a two-seater version that's believed to enable airborne early warning and control, battle management, real-time intelligence analysis, and battle space surveillance services, as well as potential lower wingman coordination as those capabilities become available. Like Russia, China doesn't just operate stealth aircraft, it also operates dedicated strategic bombers, specifically at least 200 copies of the Cheyenne H-6. The H-6 is a license-produced variant of the Tupolev Tu-16, a Soviet bomber that was phased out after the Cold War, but calling the H-6 a variant of the Tu-16 is sort of like calling the most modern iPhones a variant of the first-generation iPod Touch. The H-6 is generally regarded as a capable strategic bomber able to fly near the speed of sound at over 1,000 kilometers an hour, 650 miles per hour, at a range of 6,000 kilometers or 3,700 miles. Although its payload capacity is not known for sure, it's able to carry a wide variety of conventional and nuclear weapons. Backing up the H-6 are about 200 copies of a lighter fighter-bomber aircraft, the JH-7, which can crest over Mach 1.5 in a pinch and carry 9,000 kilograms or 20,000 pounds of munitions into battle. Besides its combat aircraft, China flies roughly 28 airborne early warning and control aircraft, including 20 advanced long-range capable KJ-500s, with another 15 or so in service to the Chinese Naval Air Force. It flies a couple of dozen aerial refueling tankers of different varieties, plus 20 IL-76 strategic airlifters and 50 copies of a homegrown Chinese design, the Cheyenne Y-20. The PLA-AF has a number of notable up-and-coming aircraft, but two stand out above the rest. The recently unveiled J-35, which will join the J-20 as a second stealth fighter aircraft, and the shadowy Cheyenne H-20, a proposed subsonic strategic stealth bomber that China's been testing for years now. Aboard its aircraft carriers, China flies 50 more J-11s and 60 copies of another aircraft, the strictly carrier-based J-15 Flying Shark. A liberally modified adaptation of the Su-33, the J-15 is a placeholder that's meant to quietly depart from service when the J-35 stealth fighter is available. Although its estimated specs are quite respectable, top speeds over Mach 2.1, a combat range of 1,270 kilometers or 800 miles, and 12 hardpoints to carry a fair bit of ammunition, plus it's got modern radar and data elements. And finally, the People's Liberation Army Ground Force flies quite a few attack helicopters, including a combined roughly 320 copies of the Apache-like Z-10 and Z-19. And finally, let's wrap up on China and circle halfway around the globe, where we reach a global superpower where air power is mentioned last, but absolutely not least. Our final entry of this episode, our final boss, if you will, is the United States of America, the proud owner of not one, not two, not three, but 4 of the 10 largest military aviation forces in the entire world. US Army Aviation, the US Marine Corps, and the US Navy all outpace nations like Egypt, South Korea, France, Germany, and more in terms of sheer number of military aircraft. But if we're talking about global air power, then it's the United States Air Force that rules all. At the razor-sharp tip of the spear in America's air arsenal, we find Lockheed Martin's F-22 Raptor, widely hailed as the best air superiority fighter ever built, with all love to its competitor back in the day, the YF-23. The Raptor is an extraordinary aircraft, made all the more impressive by the fact that it was introduced to service all the way back in 2005 when the J-20 or the Su-57 were vague conceptual outlines at best. The US flies just 187 Raptors today, and because America chose to close down the aircraft's production lines, those 187 are the only ones that will ever fly. But limited in number as she may be, the Raptor manages to be extraordinary on just about every metric. Hitting top speeds of Mach 2.25, 1,500 miles or 2,400 kilometers per hour, the Raptor can hit supercruise at Mach 1.76. It features a combat range of 530 miles, 850 kilometers, not huge, but absolutely respectable, and it can carry up to 8 air-to-air missiles in its internal weapons bays while maintaining perfectly stealthy design. Its continually upgraded avionics suite and its stealth technology are about as good as you could possibly graft onto an aircraft that first flew in the late 1990s, while its maneuverability and rumored true capabilities are the stuff of legend. Its 2 onboard computers are capable of processing 10.5 billion instructions per second, while its radar and battlefield communications transceiver grant it a keen battlefield awareness on par with some dedicated airborne early warning aircraft. Backing up the F-22, at the time of writing, it's roughly 240 combat-ready F-35 Lightning aircraft, with the US Air Force intending to eventually field a full 1,000 or more of the aircraft. While not quite as mind-bogglingly capable in the air-to-air realm as the F-22, the F-35 is thoroughly 5th generation in its design and capabilities. Pushing top speeds of Mach 1.6, carrying impressive amounts of internal and external payload, and boasting a combat range far surpassing the F-22 at 770 miles or 1,240 kilometers, the F-35 is very, very good at what it does. In addition to its stealth technology and its highly advanced avionics, it provides a level of sensor fusion far beyond what nearly any aircraft can match, granting it near complete situational awareness and optimizing it to fly into enemy airspace first, take out air defenses, and clear the way for a second wave of less advanced aircraft. It's built to be highly modular, updating continuously with the best technology available, and it's expected to integrate into both loyal wingman formations and larger formations of drones and manned aircraft, coordinating via encrypted data links. Alongside its 2 5th-generation fighters, the United States Air Force operates over 700 F-16s, although some of those aircraft are headed into retirement in the next few years. The nation flies 168 F-15 Eagles, soon to be retired once the F-35 can take over, and 219 F-15E Strike Eagles, probably sticking around in their combat role for a while longer. At present, America flies just 8 of the Eagle's successor aircraft, the F-15EX Eagle II, although it's currently slated to receive 104 and may end up purchasing a whole lot more than that. The Eagle II is a profound step up past the capabilities of its predecessor, offering exceptional high-speed performance and the ability to carry nearly 30,000 pounds or 13,500 kilograms of ordnance across a mind-blowing 23 hardpoints in total. The F-15EX is designed to come thundering into battle as a second-wave aircraft behind America's stealth fighters, relying on its partners to take out air defense and then leveraging its own insane volume of munitions to level anything that would be so unlucky as to be labeled a target. Like Russia, the United States flies a total of 3 strategic bomber designs, although one in particular does a good deal beyond anything Russia has in its arsenal. The B-2 Spirit is currently the only stealth strategic bomber aircraft in the world, and America's total of 19 airframes can fly missions that no other global aircraft could dream of. A flying wing aircraft meant to cruise at 560 miles per hour or 900 kilometers, the B-2 carries up to 50,000 pounds or 23,000 kilos of ordnance, including America's 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator bomb, or up to 16 B-61 or B-83 nuclear bombs. Despite a wingspan of 172 feet or 52.5 meters, its radar return is positively tiny, and it can deliver payloads at an intercontinental range of up to 11,000 kilometers or 6,900 miles without refueling. Joining the B-2 in flight are 2 other highly esteemed bomber aircraft, the B-1 Lancer and the B-52 Stratofortress. America flies 62 B-1s, colloquially referred to as the Bone, and it relies on the B-1 to serve as the nation's only supersonic strategic bomber. At its top speed, the Bone can hit Mach 1.25, flying up to 9,400 kilometers or 5,900 miles on a single tank of fuel. They can carry even more ordnance than the B-2, up to 75,000 pounds or 34,000 kilos across 3 internal bomb bays, and it features continually upgraded avionics despite its status as a 1980s-era variable swept-wing old heavy bomber. Finally, there's the B-52 Stratofortress, which is widely expected to hit its century mark in continual service in 2055 after being first introduced all the way back in 1955. America still flies 72 B-52s, colloquially referred to as the Buff, short for Big Ugly Fat Fella. The B-52 flies at high supersonic speeds, cruising at 509 miles per hour or 819 kilometers per hour, and it can carry ordnance across a combat range of 8,800 miles or 14,200 kilometers, making this 1950s-era aircraft the longest-range combat jet in America's arsenal today. Inside, it can carry about 70,000 pounds or 32,000 kilos of ordnance, while its pilots and crew of 5 can benefit from avionics that the Buff pilots of the 1950s would have had no real way of understanding without serious help. Just as iconic as America's bomber fleet is its close air support, where not 1 but 2 critical aircraft have remained in America's arsenal, and only America's, for the past several decades. The first is the A-10 Thunderbolt, referred to almost exclusively in practice as the Warthog. America flies 282 airframes, relying on their relatively low and slow speed profile, their very powerful Avenger rotary cannon, and their 11 hardpoints to carry just about all the munitions a trigger-happy aviator could want. Then there's the Ghost Rider, the Lockheed AC-130, a ground attack variant of the C-130 transport plane. The Ghost Rider features a couple of very big, very heavy guns sticking out of its side, designed to fly at relatively low altitudes in long, slow circles over a combat zone, usually at night, so that its side-facing gunners can lay waste to whatever they see. It's both an innovative design and a deeply terrifying one, and as such, the US is continually upgrading its Ghost Riders, even though they've passed a half-century in service. 32 still fly with the US. America's non-lethal aircraft are just as impressive, including 3 different types of early warning and control aircraft, 21 E-3 Sentry planes, 11 E-11As, and 4 copies of the E-4 Nightwatch. The Nightwatch, in particular, is a plane worth mentioning. Crafted from the airframe of a Boeing 747, it's capable of serving as a survivable mobile command post for the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, or anyone who might take over for them in the event of full or partial decapitation of the US government. With refueling, the Nightwatch is able to fly for over 150 hours straight, withstanding nuclear electromagnetic pulse blasts and maintaining communication with Washington and America's entire nuclear arsenal. The US flies no fewer than 3 different types of aircraft for electronic and psychological warfare operations, including the EA-37B Compass Core, an aircraft that can completely suppress enemy air defenses without firing a single shot. The US flies more tanker aircraft than any other nation on Earth, with a combined 500 or more currently in service across 3 types of aircraft. And even after all we've discussed, there are still more unique American aircraft to talk about. The C-5 Galaxy is one of the most capable strategic airlifters ever built, capable of carrying entire heavy-lift helicopters inside while flying at intercontinental range. America flies 52 Galaxy aircraft, plus 228 copies of the C-17 Globemaster. Its OA-1K Skywarden is a highly innovative armed propeller plane, fulfilling close air support in a way that allows it to be completely broken down, dropped into the field, and assembled with a few pairs of hands and a screwdriver by hidden special operators. The U-2 Dragon Lady is an extremely capable spy plane, able to reach a service ceiling of 80,000 feet and fly for up to 12 hours. Its presidential support planes, the VC-25s, are truly exceptional aircraft, and so are its most important unmanned aerial drones, the Sentinel, the Reaper, and the Global Hawk. But even that isn't all. Once we start branching out across the US Armed Forces, the Navy flies 421 F/A-18 Super Hornets, a far higher powered version of its predecessor, and it tends to boost that number to nearly 500. Despite these growing tallies, America's also procuring up to 230 or more F-35s for its Navy, along with a planned 100 or more E-2 Hawkeye early warning and control aircraft, 153 electronic warfare versions of the Hornet, and even 16 E-6 Mercury aircraft, airborne command posts that are meant to relay communications all across the world in the event of nuclear war. US Army Aviation flies no fewer than 824 Apache attack helicopters plus 47 smaller Little Bird helicopters that can also turn an adversary into the memory of adversary past. Additionally, the Army flies roughly 2,300 copies of the UH-60 Black Hawk. While we've held off on discussing the other air forces, owing to the high proportion of the choppers that serve in a primarily utility and transport role, the sheer number of Black Hawks in America's arsenal changes the game. Even if a proportion are unarmed, the number of Black Hawks that pack a punch is almost certainly in the high hundreds, if not thousands. Meanwhile, the United States Marine Corps intends to own well over 400 F-35s of its own once all is said and done, and currently flies 138 FA-18 Super Hornets, 87 Harrier jump jets, and 64 of its very own air refueling tankers, independent from the US Air Force. The Marines also have about 160 attack helicopters at their disposal, although that really shouldn't be a surprise to anybody familiar with the Marines at all. In the coming years, the United States is going to upgrade its air power by way of an unmanned aerial refueling drone called the Stingray. It'll adopt the Boeing E-7 Wedgetail, although probably under a different name. It's getting new airborne command centers, new next-generation air-to-air refuelers, and potentially even droves of low-cost seaplanes to handle oceanic transport needs. The Navy's FA-XX program hopes to field a sixth-generation air superiority fighter by the 2030s, while the Air Force's next-generation air dominance program aims to do the same thing, despite fairly significant cuts to the program in recent months. America intends to build loyal wingman drones for its new aircraft and may one day acknowledge shadowy, rumored black book projects like the RQ-180 spy drone and the potentially Mach 6 capable SR-72. Finally, the Air Force is ahead of schedule and under budget to field a replacement to the B-2 Spirit and B-1 Lancer, known as the B-21 Raider, slated to enter service by 2040 at the very latest. So, at long last, it's fair to say that we're done. From tiny, outdated air forces that couldn't fight much more than a local insurgency, to up-and-coming regional power players, from post-Soviet air forces to evolving NATO capabilities, and finally to these sprawling superpowers that could take on anything. These are the air forces of the world. But rather than wax poetic, we'll leave you with the Irish goodbye. Come back soon, fly safe, and thanks for watching. See you next time. Gonna go have a rest.